Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. For years, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this. But after seeing others share similar experiences here, I think it's time I finally got this off my chest. This happened back in November of 1968, November 15th to be exact. I was 16 years old, and it was our annual deer hunting trip in Roscommon County, Michigan, near St. Helens. It was me, my dad, my grandpa, and my Uncle Dave. We'd been going to the same general area for years, but that day we decided to try a new spot that Uncle Dave had scouted earlier in the season. The weather wasn't great, cloudy, kind of dreary, and cold enough that you could see your breath. Classic Michigan November. We arrived at our spot around noon after a long drive up from Flint. The area was heavily forested with these rows of pine trees that had been planted years ago. Not natural forest, but the kind where the trees are in these perfect lines. Makes it easier to walk through, but also creates these long corridors that stretch out into the distance. After we unloaded our gear from the old Chevy, Grandpa suggested we split up to cover more ground. This wasn't unusual. We always hunted separately and would meet back at the car before dark. My dad gave me the usual safety talk. Even though I'd been hunting since I was 12, I had my .30-30 rifle, some jerky in my pocket, and a small canteen of water. Remember, 3 shots in quick succession means emergency, Dad reminded me. I nodded, annoyed at being treated like a kid. But now I'm grateful for his caution. I headed west from the car while the others went in different directions. The pine rows made navigation easy. You could just follow them deeper into the forest. About 150 yards in, I found what looked like a promising spot. There were some fresh deer tracks and droppings, and a small clearing where I figured a buck might pass through. I remember checking my watch. It was around 1:30 in the afternoon, still plenty of daylight left. I decided to continue a bit further to see if I could find an even better spot. That's when everything changed. I heard it before I saw or smelled anything. There was this loud crashing sound coming from my left, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. My first thought was, deer! So I froze instantly, like every hunter knows to do. The weird thing was, the crashing stopped exactly when I stopped moving. I mean exactly. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, not moving a muscle, barely breathing. Then I took a single step forward, and immediately the crashing started again. That's when I realized something wasn't right. A deer would have either bolted away from the sound of my movement or stayed completely still. This, whatever it was, seemed to be mimicking me, and worse, it sounded like it was coming toward me, not running away. I took a few more steps, and the crashing continued, getting louder. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. Something was definitely approaching me, and it was big, much bigger than a deer. The way it moved through the underbrush sounded like something heavy, pushing aside branches and snapping twigs. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared, but I was also curious. I'd grown up in these woods, and I couldn't imagine what animal would behave this way. I decided to try to get a look at whatever was making the noise. Between the rows of pines were these thick patches of underbrush, so I couldn't see through to the next row over. I quickly jumped across to the next row of trees and crouched down behind a thick pine trunk. That's when I noticed the smell. God, that smell. It's hard to describe, but imagine a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else. Something musky and wild. It was so strong it almost made me gag. As I was trying not to throw up from the stench, I saw movement in the row I'd just left. And then I saw it. A leg, a massive white-furred leg, stepped into view. Just the leg. I couldn't see the rest of whatever it was attached to. The leg was about 4 feet of what I could see, and maybe 7 inches around. Thicker than my arm for sure. The fur was dirty white, almost yellowish in places, and long, not like a deer's short coat. The creature was only about 25 yards to my left. I realized with a shock that if I hadn't jumped to the next row when I did, I would have been face to face with whatever this was. My rifle felt suddenly small in my hands. I had a clear shot at the leg, but what good would that do? What if I just wounded it and made it angry? The 30-30 is a good deer rifle, but this thing was massive. I'd have to get a perfect shot to bring it down, and I couldn't even see its body, just that one enormous leg. So I stayed absolutely still. My legs were cramping from squatting, but I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. The creature seemed to pause too, as if sensing something. The awful smell got stronger, and I heard what sounded like deep, heavy breathing. Not like an animal panting, but more like a massive chest expanding and contracting slowly. I don't know how long I stayed there. It felt like hours, but was probably about 10 minutes. My watch ticked so loudly, I was sure the thing could hear it. Eventually, the leg moved out of my view, and I heard the crashing sounds again, this time moving away from me. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing, just dead silence. When I finally stood up, my legs nearly gave out from being crouched for so long. I was drenched in cold sweat despite the November chill. I'd like to say I bravely investigated or tracked the creature, but that would be a lie. As soon as I could move, I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could back the way I came, following the rows of pines toward where we'd parked. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, which thankfully was still there, empty. I sat in that car for over 2 hours, jumping at every sound, my rifle ready. When my dad finally came back, he could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't tell him. I just said I wasn't feeling well. Uncle Dave and Grandpa returned shortly after, and we headed home earlier than planned. We didn't get any deer that day. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen for years. When I finally told my dad about 5 years later, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just got real quiet and said that there were things in those woods that couldn't be explained. Uncle Dave had seen something similar back in the 50s, but in his case, the creature was dark-colored, not white. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. Whatever that thing was, and yes, I believe it was what people now call Bigfoot, it could have easily caught me if it wanted to. I was just a scrawny teenager, and this thing was massive. Why it didn't come after me, I'll never know. The thing that still haunts me is the intelligence it showed. The way it stopped when I stopped, moved when I moved. That's not animal behavior. That's something else, something that thinks. I've spent my life in the outdoors. I've seen bears, wolves, coyotes, and every kind of wildlife Michigan has to offer. What I saw that day wasn't any of those. The size alone rules them out. No bear has legs that long and thin. No known animal in Michigan has white fur like that, especially not in that size. I've never gone back to that specific spot. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that part of Roscommon County. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and it gets quiet, that unnatural quiet where all the birds stop singing at once, I get the feeling I'm being watched, and that smell, I've never forgotten it. Once you've smelled it, you know it instantly, if you ever smell it again. I'm 69 years old now, and I've never seen anything like it again, but I know what I saw. That white leg belonged to something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that was intelligent enough to stalk me, but for whatever reason, decided to let me go. The worst part is not knowing. Not knowing what would have happened if I hadn't jumped to that next row of trees when I did. Not knowing what the rest of it looked like beyond that massive leg. Not knowing why it was there, or where it went, or if it's still out there. I check this site regularly, looking for stories from Roscommon County. looking for mentions of a white Bigfoot. So far, I haven't found any. Part of me hopes I never do, because that would mean someone else had to go through what I did. But another part hopes I'm not alone in what I saw. If you're ever hunting near St. Helen, in those pine plantations, and you smell something awful, and the woods go quiet, don't freeze. Don't try to see what it is. Just leave. Because whatever I encountered that November afternoon in 1968 is probably still out there, and next time, it might not just walk away. Story 2. I still get goosebumps every time I think about what happened that day. It's been almost 30 years, but I can still see it so clearly, like it happened yesterday. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life, but nothing prepared me for what I saw in those woods outside Chapleau. This was back in 1992, late July or early August. The weather had been hot as hell that summer, and I remember being grateful for the breeze as I rode my ATV along the old logging trails, connecting my family's hunting cabin to my cousin Mike's farm. Those trails were like a second home to me. I'd been riding them since I was a teenager. I'd made the trip to Mike's place hundreds of times before. It was only about 7 miles through the bush, a nice straight shot that took maybe 20 minutes if I didn't stop to look around. That day was just like any other summer afternoon. Humid, bugs everywhere, the smell of pine and soil heavy in the air. I remember I was wearing my favorite faded blue t-shirt, the one with the tear on the shoulder from when I caught it on a branch the previous hunting season. I was probably about halfway to Mike's place when I first noticed something was off. The woods had gotten quiet. If you spend enough time in the forest, you know that's never a good sign. Usually there's a constant background noise, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But suddenly nothing, just the sound of my ATV engine echoing through the trees. I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe I'd spooked something bigger, a moose or a black bear probably. They're common enough around there. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 3 in the afternoon, and thinking I should still make it to Mike's before he left for his shift at the mill. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something in the middle of the path, about 50 yards ahead. At first glance, I thought it was a bear hunched over something on the ground. We'd had problems with black bears in the area that summer, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. But as I got closer, maybe 30 yards away, I realized something wasn't right. The shape was all wrong for a bear. Bears have that distinctive hump on their shoulders, and they move a certain way. This thing was squatting, almost like a person would, with its arms extended in front of it. I could see it was doing something to what looked like a deer carcass on the ground. I stopped my ATV but kept the engine idling. My first instinct was to turn around and get the hell out of there, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. The thing hadn't looked up or acknowledged me at all. It seemed completely focused on the deer, tearing pieces off and eating them, raw. I could hear the wet, tearing sounds even over my engine. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. It definitely wasn't a person. And it was big. Really big, even in its crouched position. After about a minute, though it felt like an eternity, it finally turned and looked at me. I'll never forget that moment, as long as I live. The face, it was like a nightmare version of a human face. It had this massive brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, a wide, flat nose, and a mouth that seemed too large for its face. The jaw was huge and powerful looking. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, but the hair was thinner around its eyes and cheeks, showing skin that looked almost grayish-brown. Our eyes met, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. There was intelligence in those eyes, deep-set, dark eyes that seemed to assess me for a few seconds. It didn't seem particularly afraid or aggressive, just aware, like it was deciding whether I was a threat or not. Then, as casually as you'd look away from a stranger on the street, it turned back to the deer and continued eating, like I wasn't even worth bothering with. I sat there frozen on my ATV, my knuckles white from gripping the handlebars. I couldn't run. The trail was too narrow to turn around quickly, and I'd have to get closer to the thing to go forward, so I just waited, hoping it would finish and leave. After what must have been another minute or two, it finally stood up. That's when I realized just how massive this creature was. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and I could see the muscles shifting under its hair as it moved. It wasn't fat or bulky like a bear. It was muscular, with powerful-looking arms that hung down past its waist. The hair covering its body was dark brown or black, tangled in places and matted with what I assume was blood and dirt. With no apparent effort, it reached down and picked up what was left of the deer, a full-grown doe that would have weighed at least 100 pounds, and slung it over its shoulder like it was nothing more than a backpack. Then it simply stepped off the trail and into the dense forest. It was gone within 5 or 6 strides, disappearing into the trees. The whole forest seemed to swallow it up, despite its size. I sat there for a long time after it left, just trying to calm my breathing and stop my hands from shaking. I kept waiting for it to come back, to emerge from the trees and charge at me. But the woods remained silent. Eventually, I worked up the courage to continue down the trail, giving the blood-stained spot where the deer had been a wide berth. The blood looked fresh, and there were bits of hide and bone scattered around. Whatever had killed that deer had done it recently, maybe just before I came along. I rode the rest of the way to Mike's place in a daze, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every sound. When I finally arrived, I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. Mike took one look at me and asked what the hell had happened. I told him everything while we sat on his porch. He didn't believe me at first, thought I was pulling his leg or had gotten too much sun. But he said later that the look on my face convinced him I'd seen something. Mike had lived in those woods his whole life, and while he'd never seen anything like what I described, he'd heard stories from the older locals and some of the indigenous folks who lived in the area. We grabbed his rifle and drove back to the spot in his pickup about an hour later. The blood was still there on the trail, but there was no sign of the creature. We found some unusual tracks leading off into the bush, very large, human-like footprints that sank deep into the soft ground. They were much bigger than either of our boots, maybe 15 or 16 inches long. We followed them for about 50 yards before they disappeared, where the ground got harder and rockier. The whole way back to Mike's, and later, when I rode home to our cabin, I felt like I was being watched. The skin on the back of my neck would prickle, and I'd get this overwhelming urge to look behind me, but I never saw the creature again that day. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been a bear or some other animal I just hadn't recognized. But I know what I saw. That face, those eyes. They weren't anything I could explain away. I've spent a lot of time in the wilderness since then. I still hunt, still ride those same trails. But I'm more cautious now. I don't go out alone as much, and I always carry a sidearm. There've been a few times over the years when I've felt that same sensation of being watched, or caught a strange, musky odor in the air that reminded me of the smell around that blood-stained spot on the trail. But I've never had another clear sighting. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences, and many of them match details of what I saw. The height, the proportions, the face, they're remarkably consistent. Some people call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The local Ojibwe have their own name for it. I don't know what to call it, but I know what I saw wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either. What bothers me most, even now, is how casual it was about my presence. It wasn't scared of me. It wasn't aggressive toward me. It just acknowledged me and went back to its meal. Like I was just another creature in the woods that didn't pose any threat. That level of confidence from something so large and powerful was deeply unsettling. I've told this story to very few people over the years. Most react with skepticism or outright disbelief, and I get it. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I'd have thought they were full of crap or had mistaken a bear for something else. But I know what bears look like. I've hunted them, tracked them, and seen them up close many times. What I saw that day wasn't a bear. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see it again, or if there are more of them out there. The forests around Chapleau are vast, and there are places where people rarely, if ever, there go plenty of room for something to remain hidden if it wants to stay that way. All I know for sure is that my understanding of what exists in our world changed that day. There are things in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people will never see or believe in, but they're out there. I've looked one in the eyes, and that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Story 3. I don't share this story often. Most folks think I'm just an old fool spinning yarns, but I swear on my father's grave that everything I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I remember it. It was the summer of 1897 in Siskiyou County, California. I was 34 years old then, working a small claim up in the mountains, living alone in a simple cabin I'd built myself. I'd been prospecting in that area for about 3 years, wasn't striking it rich by any means, but I was finding enough gold to keep me fed and supplied. I preferred the solitude anyway. After fighting in the Spanish-American War, I didn't much care for crowds or towns. That particular day in early June started like any other. I woke before dawn, made coffee over my small stove, and headed out to check my fishing lines I'd set the evening before in the creek that ran about 50 yards from my cabin. It was a beautiful morning, crisp mountain air, birds singing, sun just starting to filter through the pines. I remember feeling particularly at peace that morning. I was about halfway to the creek when I noticed what I thought was an oddly shaped bush about 30 yards to my right. I didn't recall seeing it there before, but I didn't think much of it at first. The light was still dim, and my eyes weren't what they used to be. As I got closer to the creek, something made me turn and look at that bush again. That's when I noticed it had moved, just slightly, but enough to catch my attention. I froze, my hand automatically moving to the knife on my belt. Bears weren't uncommon in these parts, and I'd had my share of run-ins with mountain lions, but this wasn't either of those. As my eyes adjusted and the sun rose a bit higher, I could make out what appeared to be a figure, tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, 7, maybe 8 feet in height. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was covered in thick, shaggy hair, not fur exactly, but more like the coarse hair of a horse. It was a dark brown color, almost black in the shadows. For a moment I wondered if it was some kind of bear standing on its hind legs. But the proportions were all wrong. This thing had long arms, a massive chest, and stood on 2 legs in a way that seemed entirely natural to it. Then the wind shifted, and I caught its scent. Lord Almighty, that smell! It was musky and wild, like wet dog mixed with something earthy and pungent. Not exactly foul, but powerful enough to make my nose wrinkle. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. Could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to stop. What struck me most, what I still remember clearly to this day, were its eyes. They were soft brown, almost human-like, but larger. There was intelligence there and curiosity, not the mindless aggression I'd expect from a wild animal. I'd heard stories, of course. Every prospector and trapper in these mountains had tales of the wild men of the woods. The local Karuk tribe called them Matakagmi. I'd always dismissed these stories as campfire talk, the kind of legends lonely men tell to make the wilderness seem less empty. But standing there, facing this creature, I knew the stories were true. My instinct was to run, but something told me that would be the worst thing I could do. So instead, I slowly raised my empty hands to show I meant no harm. The creature didn't move, just kept watching me with those eerily intelligent eyes. I remembered the fish I was heading to collect. Slowly, so slowly, I backed away toward the creek, keeping my eyes on the creature. It made no move to follow me. When I reached the creek, I pulled up my line. I'd caught 3 decent-sized trout. With shaking hands, I removed them from the hooks and strung them together with a piece of twine. What I did next might seem crazy, but in that moment, it felt right. I walked about halfway back toward where the creature still stood, then carefully laid the string of fish on a flat rock. I backed away, pointing at the fish and then at the creature, trying to convey that they were an offering. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost like a dog trying to understand a command. Then it made a soft huffing sound, not quite a grunt, but not quite a sigh either. I continued backing away toward my cabin. When I was about 50 yards from the fish, the creature finally moved. Its movements were fluid and surprisingly graceful for something so large. It approached the rock carefully, always keeping one eye on me. In one quick motion, it snatched up the fish and retreated back toward the tree line. At the edge of the forest, it paused and looked back at me. I swear there was something like gratitude in those eyes. Then it was gone, melting into the forest like it had never been there at all. I spent the rest of that day in my cabin, rifle across my lap, jumping at every sound. By nightfall, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. But 3 weeks later, it happened again. It was still dark, maybe 4 in the morning, when I was awakened by strange noises outside my cabin. Not threatening sounds, more like the careful movements of something large trying to be quiet. I grabbed my rifle and waited, listening. After about 10 minutes, the sound stopped. I waited another half hour before working up the courage to open my door. There, on the small clearing in front of my cabin, was a pile of fresh deer skins. 5 of them neatly stacked and perfectly removed from the animal. Any hunter knows how difficult it is to skin a deer so cleanly. These were expertly done, ready for tanning. As I stood there staring at this impossible gift, I heard a call from the forest edge. A low, melodic sound, unlike anything I'd heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite a call, but something in between. The hairs on my arms stood up. I knew it was him. I'll always think of the creature as him, though I couldn't tell you why I'm certain it was male. I raised my hand in acknowledgement. There was a rustling in the trees, and I caught a glimpse of that dark, shaggy form moving away through the forest. The skins were incredibly valuable to me. Winter would be coming in a few months, and these would make warm linings for my boots and gloves. It was a fair trade for the fish I'd given, but much more generous. After that, the gifts became somewhat regular. Every week or two, I'd wake to find something left outside my cabin, a stack of firewood arranged more neatly than I could have done it myself, a collection of berries in a crude basket made of bent twigs. Once, even half a dozen apples that must have come from some abandoned orchard, as there were no apple trees growing wild nearby. I always left something in return. More fish, some of my preserved meat, once a knife I'd made myself from a piece of good steel. The knife disappeared, and I often wondered what use he might have had for it. We settled into this strange pattern of exchange. I never saw him clearly again like I had that first morning, just glimpses through the trees or a shadow moving at the forest edge at dusk. But I felt his presence often. Sometimes when I was working my claim or hunting, I'd get the distinct feeling I was being watched. Not in a threatening way, more like someone keeping a friendly eye on me. Once, when I was struggling to drag a deer I'd shot back to my cabin, I stopped to rest. When I turned to continue, I found the deer had been moved forward about 20 yards along my path. This happened twice more before I reached my cabin. Each time I stopped to rest, the deer would be moved forward while my back was turned. I never heard or saw anything, but I knew it was him helping me. The locals, both white settlers and the Karuk, had mixed reactions when I finally worked up the courage to mention these encounters. Some thought I was crazy or drunk, others nodded knowingly. An old Karuk man told me I was blessed, that the Matakagmi only revealed themselves to those they deemed worthy of trust. They've been here longer than us, he told me. They know these mountains better than any man ever will. If one has chosen to be your friend, you are fortunate indeed. As summer turned to fall, the visits became less frequent. The last gift I received was in early October, a pile of pine nuts that must have taken hours to gather. I left a pouch of tobacco in return, though I have no idea if he had any use for it. After that, nothing. Winter came harsh that year. I often found myself staring out my window at the snow-covered forest, wondering where he was, if he was warm enough, if he had enough to eat. I felt a strange sense of loss, like a friend had moved away without saying goodbye. When spring finally came, I searched for signs of him. I left fish and meat at the edge of the clearing, but they remained untouched until I had to take them back before they spoiled. I called out that strange melodic call I'd heard him make, but there was never any response. I remained in that cabin for 2 more years, working my claim until it played out. In all that time, I never saw him again or found any sign of his presence. Sometimes I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I'd look at the deer hide jacket I'd made from his gifts, and I knew it had been real. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually met with skepticism or outright disbelief. Most people think I was just a lonely man in the woods, creating fantasies to keep myself company. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. That summer changed me, made me see the world differently, made me understand that there are things in these wild places that defy explanation, that exist beyond our narrow understanding of what's possible. I'm an old man now, and I'll likely be gone soon. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of that musky, earthy scent, and for a moment, I'm transported back to that summer morning in 1897, standing face to face with something magnificent and unknown. And I wonder if somewhere, deep in forests that grow ever smaller with each passing year, he remembers me too. Story: I've spent my whole life hiking and camping, and I've never been the type to get spooked easily. Bears, mountain lions, strange noises at night. None of that ever bothered me. But what happened to me and my buddy Eric back in September 2016 completely changed my perspective on what's really out there in the wilderness. Eric and I had been planning this trip to Glacier Peak Wilderness for months. We're both experienced backpackers and have done plenty of multi-day hikes before. The weather forecast looked perfect, not too hot, not too cold, and minimal chance of rain. We'd mapped out a 4-day route that would take us through some pretty remote areas. Looking back now, I wish we'd stuck to more popular trails. We drove out early on a Thursday morning, reached the trailhead around 10, and started hiking. That first day was exactly what we expected. Beautiful scenery, good weather, and that feeling of peace you only get when you're miles away from civilization. We covered about 12 miles before setting up camp near a small stream. We cooked dinner, had a couple beers we'd packed in, worth the extra weight, and crashed early. Everything was totally normal. The next morning is when things started to feel off. We broke camp around 8 and hit the trail. About 2 hours in, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. And if you spend any time outdoors, you know that's never a good sign. Usually, there's always background noise, birds, insects, small animals rustling in the underbrush. But suddenly, nothing, just the sound of our boots on the trail and our breathing. I nudged Eric and whispered, "Hey, you notice how quiet it is?" He nodded, looking around. "Yeah, weird. Maybe there's a predator nearby." We kept moving, figuring whatever it was would go its own way, but the silence followed us for miles. It was like walking through a vacuum, and it started to mess with my head. Every so often I'd hear what sounded like a branch snap in the distance, always behind us, but whenever I'd stop to listen, there was nothing. By mid-afternoon, I was certain we were being followed. Not by a person. The footsteps were too calculated, too careful, and whatever it was matched our pace perfectly. When we sped up, it sped up. When we stopped, it stopped. It stayed just far enough away that we couldn't see it through the trees, but close enough that we knew it was there. There's something following us, I told Eric when we stopped for water. I know, he said quietly. I've been hearing it for the last hour. It's big, whatever it is. We debated turning back, but we were already deeper into the wilderness than we were from the trailhead. Going forward made more sense. We had a satellite phone for emergencies, but being followed by something didn't seem like a valid reason to call for help. Not yet, anyway. As dusk approached, we found a small clearing to set up camp. We hadn't planned to stop so early, but neither of us wanted to be hiking after dark, not with whatever was out there. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and started preparing dinner, trying to act normal despite the growing unease. That's when the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite just beyond the tree line, and not just from one direction, from multiple directions. It sounded like there were at least 3 of them, moving independently around our camp. "What the hell is that?" Eric whispered, his hand gripping his hunting knife. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "Bear? No, bears don't move like that." Then came the growls, low, rumbling growls that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Not like a bear or a cougar, nothing I'd ever heard before. They were deeper, more guttural, almost like they were coming from something with a chest cavity much larger than any animal I knew existed in these woods. We built the fire up as big as we could, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. As darkness fell completely, I could feel eyes watching us from the trees. Not just animal curiosity, this felt intelligent, calculating. The footsteps continued to circle us, never coming too close to the firelight, but never moving away either. Around 9 o'clock, something hit the side of our tent. A branch or rock thrown with enough force to make the whole structure shake. Eric and I looked at each other, the same thought clearly running through both our minds. We need to get the hell out of here. Another branch crashed into our campsite, landing just feet from where we sat. Then another and another. It was like they were testing us, seeing how we'd react. And with each projectile, the growls grew louder, more threatening. "We need to go," I said, already packing essential items into my backpack. "Now." Eric nodded, quickly doing the same. "Leave the tent. Just grab what we absolutely need." We stuffed our backpacks with water, some food, our headlamps, the satellite phone, and an extra layer of clothing. The rest, the tent, cooking gear, sleeping bags, we left behind. It wasn't worth it. The moment we stepped away from the fire, the growling intensified. Whatever was out there didn't want us to leave, or maybe it did, just not in the direction we were heading. We switched on our headlamps and started back down the trail, moving as quickly as we could without running. Running feels like the right instinct when you're scared, but in the wilderness at night, it's a good way to break an ankle or worse. The creatures, I don't know what else to call them, followed us. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush on either side of the trail, still keeping pace with us. Sometimes they'd get ahead, and we'd hear movement blocking the path forward, forcing us to stop or change direction. It was like they were herding us. After about 30 minutes of this terrifying game, Eric suddenly froze, his flashlight beam fixed on a point just off the trail. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. Standing there, partially hidden by a large pine tree, was something. Something massive. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. But it was the eyes that I'll never forget, amber-colored and reflecting our light, looking directly at us with undeniable intelligence. The rest of its face was shadowed, but I could make out a broad, flat nose and a heavy brow ridge. For a split second, we all just stared at each other. Eric and me frozen in fear, and this creature seemingly just as surprised that we'd spotted it. Then it let out a roar that seemed to shake the entire forest and stepped behind the tree, disappearing from view. "Run," I whispered, and then louder, "Run!" We bolted down the trail, no longer concerned about twisting an ankle. Pure adrenaline took over. We could hear them running too, heavy footfalls pounding the earth, branches snapping, those horrible growls growing more frenzied. They were faster than us, much faster, but they didn't overtake us. They just kept pace, sometimes getting ahead, sometimes falling behind, always keeping us moving in a specific direction. At one point, I tripped on an exposed root and went down hard, scraping my hands and knees on the rocky trail. Before I could even push myself up, Eric was yanking me to my feet, his face pale with terror. "It was right there," he gasped. "Right behind you, like 10 feet away." I didn't look back. I couldn't. We just kept running, for what felt like hours. This nightmarish chase continued. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but stopping wasn't an option. The creatures seemed tireless, communicating with each other through grunts and whoops that echoed through the trees. Eventually the trail widened, and I recognized landmarks from our hike in. We were getting closer to the trailhead, to our car, to safety. The creatures seemed to sense this too, because their behavior changed. They became more aggressive, more desperate. Rocks and branches rained down around us. One struck me in the shoulder hard enough to make me stumble, but Eric grabbed my arm and kept me moving. Finally, mercifully, we saw the parking area ahead. Our pace somehow quickened despite our exhaustion. The sounds of pursuit began to fade as we approached the clearing where a few cars, including ours, sat under the bright moon. We reached the car, fumbling with the keys in trembling hands, and practically dove inside. I locked the doors immediately, started the engine, and flipped on the high beams, illuminating the tree line we'd just emerged from. For several minutes, we just sat there, gasping for breath, unable to speak. The forest edge remained still and silent. Whatever had chased us for miles hadn't followed us into the open. As I put the car in reverse, ready to get the hell out of there, movement caught my eye. At the very edge of the headlight's reach, just inside the tree line, stood 3 massive hair-covered figures. They were partially obscured by the foliage, but I could clearly see their outlines. Huge, barrel-chested, powerfully built. One seemed to raise its arm, almost like a farewell gesture, before they melted back into the darkness of the forest. We drove non-stop back to Seattle, barely speaking. What could we say? We both knew what we'd seen, what had pursued us. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name you want to give them. Not the gentle, curious creatures from the Patterson-Gimlin film that I'd always imagined, but territorial, aggressive beings that had made it clear we weren't welcome in their domain. It's been 7 years since that night, and I've only been back to the wilderness a handful of times, always sticking to popular, well-traveled trails. Eric hasn't gone hiking at all. Some experiences fundamentally change you, make you see the world differently, make you realize that humans aren't always at the top of the food chain, and that there are things out there we don't understand, things that can reduce us to our most primal state of fear. I still have nightmares about those amber eyes staring at me from the darkness, about what might have happened if we hadn't made it back to the car. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those deep, rumbling growls right outside my bedroom window. Story 5. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family, but I need to get this off my chest. What I saw back in May of 2002 has been haunting me for over 20 years now. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I had just landed a job as a tour guide at Glacier National Park. It was my dream job. I'd always loved the outdoors, hiking, wildlife, all that stuff. I grew up in Montana, and the park was like a second home to me. Getting paid to show people around felt like winning the lottery. The training process was pretty intense. For 2 weeks, we had classroom sessions learning about the park's history, geology, wildlife, safety protocols, you name it. Then came the practical part, where we had to observe experienced guides before leading tours ourselves. That particular day, I was shadowing Rick, one of the senior guides who'd been working at Glacier for over 15 years. The plan was simple. Join his tour group heading up to Waterton Lakes in Canada. It's part of the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. Observe how he handled everything, take notes, and learn. It was a clear Tuesday morning in mid-May. The weather was perfect. About 65 degrees, sunny, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. Our group consisted of around 20 tourists, mostly older couples and a few families with teenagers. Rick was great, personable, knowledgeable, and he had this way of making even the most mundane facts sound interesting. The tour itself went smoothly. We crossed into Canada with no issues, explored Waterton for a few hours, had lunch at this little cafe overlooking the lake, and started heading back around 4 in the afternoon. Everyone was tired but happy, some dozing off on the bus as we made our way through the winding roads back toward the US border. I was sitting near the front, right behind Rick, who was pointing out landmarks to the few people who were still awake. The bus was mostly quiet, except for his occasional commentary and the low hum of the engine. About 20 minutes from the border, we were driving alongside this river, the Waterton River, I think. The road hugged the riverbank pretty closely at that point. Rick suddenly pointed out the window and said, "Looks like someone's trying their luck with the trout today." I glanced out to where he was pointing and saw what he meant. A figure was moving along the riverbank, maybe 100 yards away. At first glance, it did look like a fisherman. Most of the tourists barely reacted, just a quick look before returning to their naps or conversations. But something about the figure caught my attention. I remember leaning closer to the window, squinting to get a better look. The bus was moving at about 40 miles per hour, so we weren't flying past, but we weren't crawling either. The figure was walking in the same direction we were driving, so I had maybe 15 or 20 seconds to observe it, and that's when I realized something was off. Way off. The fisherman wasn't walking like a person. There was something fundamentally wrong with its gait, like its knees bent differently or something. It wasn't limping or injured, it was just moving wrong, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I grabbed my binoculars from my backpack, I always carried them during tours, and quickly focused on the figure. What I saw through those lenses made my blood run cold. This wasn't a fisherman, it wasn't a person at all. The figure was tall, I'd estimate at least 7 feet. It was covered from head to toe in dark, reddish-brown hair or fur. Not like someone wearing a coat. The hair was part of it. It was completely naked otherwise. No clothing, no gear, nothing. Its arms hung longer than a human's should, almost to its knees. And the way it moved. God, the way it moved. Each step was deliberate, powerful, with a slight swing to its shoulders. I could only see its profile, but what struck me was how fluid its motion was. Despite its strange gait, it moved with purpose, with a kind of natural confidence that suggested it absolutely belonged there, like it knew this terrain better than any human ever could. I must have made some kind of noise, because Rick glanced at me and asked if I was okay. I couldn't even respond. My mouth had gone completely dry, and my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the binoculars. By the time I managed to stammer out something about the person on the riverbank, we had already rounded a bend in the road, and the figure was gone from view. Rick just shrugged and said something about locals knowing all the good fishing spots, but I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a local. It wasn't a hiker or a fisherman wearing some weird outfit. And it absolutely wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs, which is what my brain desperately tried to tell me at first. I had seen a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, in broad daylight on a regular Tuesday afternoon in May. The rest of the trip back to the US border is a blur in my memory. I remember sitting there, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept replaying those 15 seconds in my mind, trying to convince myself I'd made a mistake, that my eyes had played tricks on me. But the image was burned into my brain. The height, the fur, the way it moved. It was not human, and it was not any known animal I'd ever studied or encountered. When we got back to park headquarters, I was in a daze. Rick asked if I was feeling carsick, and I just nodded, not knowing how else to explain my state. How do you tell someone, especially someone who's supposed to be mentoring you in a professional setting, that you just saw a mythical creature that most people think is a hoax? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to write down details before I forgot them, the exact location, the time, the weather conditions, the color of its fur, the length of its stride. Everything I could remember. The next morning I considered telling my supervisor. I even drafted an email. But then I thought about how it would sound. A brand new guide, not even fully trained, claiming to have seen Bigfoot on his first observation tour. It would be career suicide. They'd think I was either lying for attention or not mentally stable enough for the job. So I kept quiet. I did my training. I led my tours. I became one of the more popular guides at Glacier over the next few years. But I never took groups to Waterton without feeling a mix of hope and dread. Hope that I might see it again and confirm I wasn't crazy, and dread for exactly the same reason. I've read every book, every article, every forum post about Sasquatch sightings in the Northern Rockies since then. Some accounts match what I saw so closely it gives me chills. The height, the reddish-brown fur, the distinctive gait. People describing the same unnerving feeling I had, that you're looking at something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does. What bothers me most isn't that I saw something impossible. It's that in that brief moment, when our eyes met, because yes, it did turn its head slightly as we passed, and I swear it looked right at me through those binoculars. I felt recognized, not as prey or a threat, but as another intelligent being. There was awareness there, intelligence, maybe even curiosity. That's the part that keeps me up at night sometimes, not fear that these creatures exist, but the implication of what that means. How many are there? How have they remained hidden for so long? How intelligent are they? Do they have their own society, their own language? Are they watching us more than we realize? I've gone back to that stretch of river several times over the years, always alone, always with my camera ready. I've never seen it again, but I've found things, broken branches too high up for a human to reach, strange patterns of disturbed ground that don't match any known animal tracks. And once, a clump of reddish-brown hair caught on a tree bark that didn't look like bear or elk or anything else native to the area. I still have that hair sample preserved in a Ziploc bag in my desk drawer. I've never had it tested. Part of me doesn't want to know. I still work in Glacier, though not as a guide anymore. I'm in resource management now, and every time I'm out in the field, every time I hike into the backcountry, I find myself scanning the tree lines, the riverbanks, the meadows, looking for that distinctive silhouette, that unmistakable gait. I know what I saw that day in 2002. It wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't my imagination. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. And it's out there, moving through the wilderness with that same deliberate grace I witnessed for those 15 seconds over 20 years ago. Sometimes I think about reaching out to one of those Bigfoot research groups, sharing my story, showing them the hair sample. But then I think about that moment of recognition, that flash of awareness I saw in its eyes. And I wonder if these creatures have managed to survive precisely because people like me hesitate to expose them. So I keep my story to myself, or I did until now. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if someone else told me this same story. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I'm alone in the backcountry and the wind dies down and everything goes quiet, I get the distinct feeling that I'm being watched. Not with malice, but with the same curiosity I felt that day on the bus. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 6. It was mid-October, 1869. I was working as a surveyor for the railroad company, mapping out potential routes through the Sierra foothills about 20 miles south of Grayson. There were 4 of us in the party, myself, Thomas, our lead engineer, and 2 local guides, Jeremiah and his son Ben. We'd been camping in the area for nearly 2 weeks, and I'd grown used to the rhythm of our days. Up at dawn, mapping and measuring until dusk, then evenings around the campfire before turning in. That particular morning started no different than the others. The air had a bite to it, that unmistakable autumn chill that tells you winter isn't far behind. The maple and oak trees were ablaze with color, deep reds and bright yellows against the dark green of the pines. It would have been beautiful if I'd known what was coming. We'd split into pairs that day. Thomas wanted to survey the eastern ridge, while Jeremiah and I headed west into a narrow valley that looked promising for a potential rail passage. Ben stayed behind to mind the camp. I remember being in a good mood as Jeremiah and I set out. The sun was warming the day nicely, and we'd spotted a herd of deer at dawn, a good omen or so I thought. We worked steadily through the morning, taking measurements, marking trees, noting the terrain in my field book. Nothing unusual. It was early afternoon when things changed. We'd stopped for a quick meal by a small stream. I was just finishing my bread and jerky when Jeremiah suddenly froze, his tin cup halfway to his lips. I'll never forget the look on his face, like he'd seen a ghost. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I heard nothing but the gentle gurgle of the stream and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then it came, a sound that wasn't quite right. Not a bird, not a deer, not anything I recognized. A sort of low, huffing grunt followed by a sharp, high-pitched whine. "What is that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jeremiah shook his head slowly. "Not sure, but I don't like it." He reached for his rifle, an old Sharps he carried everywhere, and nodded for me to pack up our things. I did so quickly, trying to ignore the prickle of unease creeping up my spine. We moved cautiously upstream, following the sound. I don't know why we didn't just head back to camp. Curiosity, I suppose, or stupidity. The sound came again, louder this time, and Jeremiah stopped so suddenly I nearly ran into him. "There," he breathed, pointing toward a thicket of manzanita about 50 yards ahead. At first I saw nothing, just brush and shadows. Then the brush moved, not like it would in the wind, but deliberately, as something pushed through it, and then it emerged. God help me, I still struggle to describe what I saw. It was shaped like a man, but no man I'd ever seen. Maybe 5 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. Its shoulders were unnaturally broad and square, like a box. The arms hung down past its knees, far too long for its body, and its legs, they seemed too short, stumpy almost, like they belonged to a different creature entirely. But it was the hair that first caught my eye. The entire body was covered in thick, cinnamon-colored hair, not fur exactly, but more like human hair, just everywhere. On top of its head, the hair grew in a wild shock, almost like a mane. "What in God's name?" I whispered. The creature froze, as if it had heard me from that distance. Then it turned slowly in our direction. I felt my blood run cold. There was no neck. Its head sat directly on those squared shoulders. And its face is what haunts me still. Small eyes, set deep like a pig's eyes, but they caught the afternoon sun and seemed to flash orange for just a moment. The nose was flat and broad, also pig-like, with wide nostrils that flared as it sniffed the air. But it was the mouth that turned my legs to water. When it opened, I saw teeth, not flat teeth like ours, but prominent fangs that jutted out from its upper jaw. Jeremiah raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking badly. "Don't," I hissed, "don't provoke it." The creature stood perfectly still, watching us. I had the uncomfortable sensation it was thinking, assessing us just as we were assessing it. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool air. Then something else moved in the brush behind it. A second creature emerged, similar in build, but slightly smaller. Its hair was a shade lighter, and there was something in its movement that suggested it might be female. She, if that's what it was, moved up beside the first one, making a soft, chittering sound. "Sweet Jesus," Jeremiah muttered. "There's two of them." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up with fear. These weren't bears or wolves or any animal I recognized. They walked upright. They moved with purpose. They communicated with each other. But they weren't human, not even close. The first creature, the male I assumed, made a sudden grunting sound and took a step toward us. Jeremiah stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard. His rifle clattered against a rock. The sound seemed to startle the creatures. Both of them turned their horrible heads toward us, those pig-like eyes now clearly visible even from where we stood. And in the shadows of the trees, I swear to God, their eyes glowed orange. I helped Jeremiah to his feet, neither of us daring to take our eyes off the pair. They were maybe 40 yards away now, standing perfectly still except for their nostrils, which flared rhythmically as they scented the air. "Back away slowly," I whispered. "Don't run." We began to retreat, step by careful step. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. Sweat ran down my back despite the cool air. 20 yards, 30. We kept backing away. That's when the male made a sound I'll never forget. A high, keening wail that rose to a pitch no human throat could produce. It echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to tell which direction it came from. It felt like it was everywhere at once. "Run," Jeremiah said, his voice cracking. "Now!" We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. I just wanted to get away, to put as much distance as possible between us and those things. Behind us I heard movement, branches snapping, stones clattering. They were following us. I don't know how long we ran, minutes, an hour. Time seemed to stretch and contract. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear kept me moving. The forest grew denser, the ground more uneven. Twice I nearly fell, catching myself on tree trunks, the rough bark tearing at my palms. Eventually we broke into a small clearing and stopped, gasping for breath. I bent double, hands on my knees, spots dancing before my eyes from exertion. "Do you think—" I began, but Jeremiah cut me off with a sharp gesture. "Listen," he said. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. At first, nothing. Then faintly, that same huffing grunt we'd heard before, but from a different direction. "They're circling us," Jeremiah said, his voice barely audible. A cold dread settled in my stomach. The clearing suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. I looked around frantically, trying to determine which way to run, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. Then I saw them. Not one pair of eyes, but three. Glowing orange in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. They'd been joined by another. "Jeremiah," I breathed, nodding toward the eyes. He saw them too. Slowly, he raised his rifle. "Don't shoot unless they charge," he whispered. "We need to back away, find high ground." We began to edge backward, toward what looked like a rocky outcropping at the far end of the clearing. The eyes followed our movement, blinking occasionally, but never leaving us. We were halfway across when the first creature stepped into the clearing. In the full light of day, it was even more terrifying than before. The cinnamon hair caught the sunlight, giving it an almost reddish glow. Its body was thick and muscular under that hair, the chest broad and powerful. Those disproportionately long arms swung slightly as it walked, Hands, yes, hands, with opposable thumbs, curling and uncurling. But it was the face I couldn't look away from. In the clearing, I could see it clearly. The pig-like snout and eyes, but with a forehead that sloped back sharply, giving its head a pointed appearance. And when it opened its mouth, those fangs gleamed white and sharp. The female emerged next, followed by a third, larger than the female but smaller than the first male. A juvenile, perhaps. They spread out, forming a loose semicircle, cutting off our retreat to the rocks. "Jeremiah," I said, my voice trembling. "What do we do?" He didn't answer. His rifle was trained on the largest creature, but I could see his hands shaking. The big male took another step forward, then another. It was maybe 20 yards away now, close enough that I could smell it, a strong, musky odor, unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not animal, not human, but something in between. It made that keening sound again, and the other two responded with similar cries. The noise bounced off the trees, surrounding us, disorienting us. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did little to block out the sound. When the wailing stopped, the big male charged. It happened so fast. One moment it was standing there, the next it was rushing toward us with a speed I wouldn't have thought possible on those short legs. Jeremiah fired, the shot deafeningly loud in the clearing. The creature stumbled, but didn't fall. "Run!" Jeremiah shouted, working the lever on his rifle. I turned to flee, but the other two creatures were already moving to cut us off. We were trapped. Jeremiah fired again. This time the big male went down, clutching at its shoulder, but it wasn't dead. It rolled on the ground, making a high, shrieking sound that sent chills down my spine. The other two hesitated, looking at their fallen companion. Then the female made a decision. She rushed not toward us, but toward the injured male. The juvenile followed. They reached the thrashing creature, and I still can't believe what I saw. They picked it up, one on each side, supporting its weight between them. Then they looked at us. Those orange eyes fixed on us with an intelligence that was undeniable, and in them I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Hatred. Pure, unmistakable hatred. They backed away, carrying the injured male between them. At the edge of the clearing, they turned and vanished into the dense forest. Jeremiah and I stood there, frozen in place, for what felt like an eternity. My ears rang from the gunshots, my throat was dry from fear, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "We need to get back to camp," Jeremiah finally said, his voice hoarse, "before they come back." We set off at a fast pace, checking over our shoulders constantly. Jeremiah kept his rifle ready, and I'd drawn my revolver, though I doubted it would do much good against those creatures if they decided to attack again. It took us nearly 3 hours to find our way back to camp. The sun was low in the sky by the time we stumbled into the clearing where Thomas and Ben were waiting, looking worried. "Where the hell have you been?" Thomas demanded. "We were about to come looking for you." I couldn't speak. I just collapsed by the fire, shaking uncontrollably. Jeremiah told them what we'd seen, his voice steady, but his hands still trembling as he poured himself a cup of whiskey from his flask. Thomas and Ben exchanged looks. I could tell they didn't believe us. How could they? I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. "Maybe it was bears," Thomas suggested. "In the shadows, playing tricks on your eyes." Jeremiah shook his head firmly. "It wasn't bears. It wasn't anything I've ever seen before." We left the next morning, abandoning the survey. Thomas was furious, but Jeremiah refused to stay another day, and I backed him up. Ben seemed uneasy, not like he believed us exactly, but like he wasn't willing to take chances. That night, as we made camp miles away from that valley, I heard it again. That high, keening wail far in the distance. Jeremiah heard it too. I saw him stiffen, his hand going to his rifle. But Thomas and Ben slept through it, or pretended to. By morning, we convinced ourselves we'd imagined it. We never went back to finish the survey. Another team was sent the following spring. They reported nothing unusual, just difficult terrain unsuitable for railroad construction. But sometimes, on autumn nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that wailing cry again, and I see those orange eyes, glowing with hatred, watching me from the darkness. I don't know what we encountered that day. Some kind of animal unknown to science? A tribe of creatures that had somehow remained hidden in those remote valleys. I have no answers. All I know is that they're out there, and they remember us as clearly as I remember them. Story 7. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me and my wife Lisa last Friday. It was September 22nd of this year, and we were just looking to enjoy a nice afternoon outdoors before the weather turns cold. I'm writing this down while it's still fresh in my mind, partly because I need to process it, but also because I'm hoping someone here might have experienced something similar. Lisa and I have these UTVs we like to ride on weekends. Nothing fancy, just a fun way to explore the backwoods and get away from everything. We live near Twiggs County in Georgia, and there's this stretch of DNR land off Westlake Road that has some really beautiful trails and access to the river. It's pretty remote. You have to drive about 4 miles from the nearest paved road to reach this makeshift boat ramp we like to visit. I work as a lineman for the power company, climbing telephone poles 5 days a week, so being outdoors is nothing new to me. I'd consider myself pretty familiar with the woods and what you might encounter out there. Lisa works from home doing medical billing, so these weekend trips are her chance to get some fresh air and sunshine. We got to the boat ramp around 2 in the afternoon. The day was perfect, not too hot, maybe 75 degrees with a light breeze. This spot is seriously secluded. We hadn't seen another vehicle for at least the last 3 miles on the dirt road in. That's part of why we like it. You can really disconnect there. After parking the UTV at the boat ramp, we decided to walk along the riverbank for a bit. The water was running clear and slow, and we were just enjoying the quiet. Lisa was taking pictures of some interesting rocks she found, and I was skipping stones across the water. Normal stuff. Then it hit us. This smell. God, I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was like someone had taken a garbage truck full of rotting meat and rolled it through a kennel of dog crap that had been sitting in the summer sun for a week. It was so sudden and so intense that Lisa actually gagged. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was the worst thing I've ever smelled in my life, and I've cleaned out my share of hunt camp freezers after power outages. "What is that?" Lisa said, covering her nose with her shirt. "Did you step in something?" I looked down at my boots, thinking maybe I'd tracked through something nasty. Nothing. Then we checked the UTV tires, thinking maybe we'd run over something dead on the way in. Still nothing. The smell seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Maybe there's a dead animal nearby," I suggested, but we couldn't see anything obvious. The smell was so bad that Lisa walked over to the river's edge and actually rinsed off her shoes in the water, thinking she must have stepped in something without realizing it. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I've been in the woods my whole life, hunting, fishing, camping. I've encountered bears, wild hogs, all kinds of critters. But something about this smell put me on edge in a way I couldn't explain. It felt deliberate somehow, like it was meant to make us uncomfortable. After about 5 minutes, the smell seemed to fade a bit, or maybe we just got used to it. Lisa had finished rinsing her shoes, and I was looking around, still trying to figure out where the smell had come from. We decided we'd had enough and were going to head back to the UTV and try another spot further downriver. That's when it happened. We had just turned around to walk back up from the riverbank when something large flew over our heads. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was a rock, a big one, maybe 7 inches across, and it sailed right over us and splashed into the water behind us. I froze. Lisa grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Rob, what the hell was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, another rock about the same size followed the same path, arcing high over our heads and landing with a heavy splash in the river. Time seemed to stop. I scanned the tree line, looking for whoever must be throwing these rocks, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds of someone running away, nothing. Just the trees, the river, and us. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded strange even to me, higher pitched than normal. "Is someone there?" No response. "This isn't funny," I yelled, trying to sound angry instead of terrified. The woods remained silent except for the normal bird sounds and the flowing river. I'm not ashamed to admit that at this point adrenaline took over. I grabbed Lisa's hand and we practically ran back to the UTV. I've never started that engine so fast in my life. As we drove away, I kept looking back over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone or anything. The 4-mile drive back to the main road felt like 40. We didn't talk much, just kept checking the mirrors and the woods around us. Once we hit pavement, I finally felt like I could breathe again. "What just happened back there?" Lisa finally asked when we were about halfway home. "Someone was messing with us," I said, not believing it even as the words came out of my mouth. We hadn't seen another soul out there. The nearest house was miles away. Who would hike all that way just to throw rocks at random people? Lisa pulled out her phone once we got back into cell service range. She's always been the research person in our relationship. "I'm going to look this up," she said. I could tell she was still shaken. "Look what up?" I asked. "People throwing rocks in the woods?" "No," she said, typing on her phone. "The smell plus the rocks." I laughed, but it came out sounding nervous. "What are you going to search for? Bad smell throws rocks?" She didn't laugh. "That's exactly what I'm searching for." I focused on driving, figuring she wouldn't find anything. A couple minutes later, she made this little gasping sound. "Rob," she said, her voice weird and tight. "You need to look at this when we get home." When we finally got back to our house, Lisa showed me what she'd found. She had searched bad smell throws rocks, and the results were all about Bigfoot. Apparently, there are hundreds of reports of people experiencing exactly what we had. An overwhelming stench, followed by rocks being thrown, often in remote areas. I'm a practical guy. I don't believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. But something about those search results made the hair on my arms stand up. The next day, I was still thinking about those rocks. Something wasn't adding up. Those weren't pebbles someone was tossing at us. They were legitimate rocks, the kind you'd use to build a fire pit. Heavy, and they flew so high and far. I decided to do a little experiment. I found some rocks about the same size as the ones that had been thrown at us. Roughly 7 inches in diameter, maybe 5 or 6 pounds each. I took them out to our backyard, which backs up to a 2-lane county road. Now, I'm 40 years old, but I stay in good shape. Climbing telephone poles every day is no joke. I'm 6'1", 200 pounds, and I can hold my own physically. I took one of those rocks and threw it as hard as I could across our yard toward the road. I managed to get it maybe 6 feet high, and it landed just past the road's edge. That's it. Maybe 20 feet total distance, and I honestly felt like I might have pulled something in my shoulder. Whatever threw those rocks at us had launched them at least 25 feet high, and they flew nearly 45 yards. That's 3 times farther than I could throw, and much higher. It would take someone with incredible strength to make that kind of throw. Like professional athlete-level strength. And then there's the location. We were 4 miles down a dirt road that's barely maintained. You can't just walk there without spending most of a day hiking in. You need an ATV, UTV, or a serious 4-wheel drive vehicle to access it in any reasonable amount of time. The idea that someone would hike all that way, wait for random people to show up, then throw rocks at them and disappear without a trace makes absolutely no sense. I've been back through this in my head 100 times since Friday. I've considered every explanation I can think of. Kids playing pranks. No way they could throw rocks that size that far. And how would they get out there? Hunter messing with us. Possible, but hunting season hasn't started yet. And why would they just throw rocks instead of showing themselves? I've been in those woods my entire life and never experienced anything like this. The smell, the rocks, the complete silence, it all felt wrong in a way I can't fully explain. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or some forest monster. I'm really not. But I also can't explain what happened out there. All I know is that Lisa and I won't be going back to that spot, maybe not anywhere that remote, for a long time. I still find myself looking out the window at night, wondering what's in the woods behind our house. I've lived in rural Georgia my whole life and never been afraid of the forest until now. I keep telling myself that whatever it was, it's still out there by the river far from our home. But then I remember that smell and those rocks flying overhead, and I'm not so sure anymore. Story 8. I can't believe I'm finally sharing this. It's been almost 30 years, but that day in Tanner Creek still gives me nightmares. I've told a few close friends over beers, but I've never written it all down until now, summer of 1993. I was 32, in the best shape of my life. I'd been trail running for almost a decade by then, mostly around the Columbia River Gorge area. Anyone who knows Oregon knows how beautiful the trails are there. Towering Douglas firs, moss-covered everything, that clean Pacific Northwest air. I'd run hundreds of miles of trails, seen bears, cougars from a distance, all kinds of wildlife. Nothing ever scared me out there. Until Tanner Creek. It was a Wednesday in late July. I remember because I'd taken the day off work to avoid the weekend crowds. The weather was perfect. About 70 degrees, slight breeze, not a cloud in the sky. I packed light, water bottle, trail mix, lightweight windbreaker tied around my waist. My trusty Nikes had about 300 miles on them, but still had good tread. I'd been wanting to explore this service road behind Bonneville Dam that a buddy from work had told me about. He said it was technically off limits, but the gate was usually easy to get around, and Forest Service rarely patrolled it. The appeal was the solitude. Miles of untouched wilderness between Tanner Creek and Mount Hood, with no other runners or hikers to dodge. I parked my old Toyota 4Runner at a small pullout about a quarter-mile from the dam, changed into my running gear, and walked to the gate. It was padlocked with a rusty chain, but there was plenty of space to slip through on the right side. The sign said, "Authorized personnel only," and something about federal property. But like I said, my buddy insisted nobody cared. The service road was gravel, well maintained. It followed Tanner Creek uphill for about half a mile before curving east into denser forest. The first 20 minutes were uneventful, just a good steady run at about an 8-minute mile pace. I wasn't pushing hard, just enjoying being out there. The road gradually climbed, and I could see the Columbia River getting smaller behind me. Massive basalt cliffs towered on my right side, with thick forest below the road to my left, sloping down toward what I assumed was the creek, though I couldn't see it through the vegetation. Around 30 minutes in, I hit my stride. Anyone who runs knows that feeling. When your breathing settles, your muscles warm up, and you feel like you could go forever. The road had leveled out a bit, cutting through an old-growth section with massive cedars that blocked most of the sunlight. It was cooler there, almost chilly, despite being July. That's when I felt it, not heard it, not saw it, felt it. That sensation when you know you're being watched. At first, I brushed it off. When you're alone in the woods, your mind plays tricks. I kept running, but more alert now, scanning the forest. Nothing seemed out of place. 5 minutes later, I heard the first sound, a cracking branch from the forest to my left, down the slope. I slowed a bit, thinking it might be a deer. We had plenty of black-tailed deer in the area, but then another crack and another keeping pace with me. Whatever it was moving parallel to the road, about 30 yards into the brush. I stopped. The movement stopped. I started again, and within seconds, I heard it moving again. It wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. I could hear vegetation being pushed aside, small trees swaying. This was no deer. I picked up my pace to a fast run, and the crashing sounds kept up, easily matching my speed. That's when I realized what was bothering me so much. This thing was keeping pace with me through thick underbrush, uphill and downhill terrain, while I was on a smooth road. That's not normal. Nothing moves that efficiently through that type of forest. "Hello," I called out, slowing to a jog. "Someone there?" Silence for 3 seconds, then, from the trees, "Someone there?" It wasn't an echo. I know what echoes sound like in the mountains. This was different, a deliberate response, mimicking my inflection but with a strange, guttural quality, like someone trying to speak English who'd never heard it before. I stopped dead in my tracks. Every hair on my arm stood up. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative, despite my racing heart. "Who's there?" came the reply, but slower, deeper. Jesus Christ. I told myself it had to be someone messing with me. Some Forest Service worker, or maybe another hiker playing a prank. "Come out where I can see you!" I yelled. Nothing. Then movement again, but not toward the road, parallel to it, still keeping alongside me but hidden in the trees. I started running again, faster now. The thing in the forest kept pace. I could hear branches snapping, the sound of heavy footfalls on soft earth, too heavy for a person. And it was fast, matching my now 9-minute mile pace through terrain that would have most hikers struggling at a slow walk. After about 2 minutes of this terrifying cat-and-mouse game, I decided to test whatever was following me. "Hello, hello, hello," I called out in a sing-song voice. Almost immediately, "Hi-yo, hi-yo, hi-yo." The voice was all wrong. It had my rhythm and pattern, but the sound was deep, resonant, almost like it was coming from a barrel. And that wasn't what someone would naturally say back. It wasn't hello, but some approximation, like it was learning, imitating. I was about 2 miles in by this point, and the road curved sharply ahead. For the first time, I could see down into the ravine where the sounds were coming from. The forest was thick, a mix of fir, log, and dense underbrush. I couldn't see anything moving, but I could hear it. I'm not sure what possessed me, but I picked up a rock from the roadside and hurled it toward the sound. Stupid, I know. The rock disappeared into the greenery, and there was a moment of silence. Then a small boulder, came sailing out of the forest and landed on the road about 15 feet ahead of me. It hit with such force that it bounced and rolled, leaving a small crater in the gravel. That's when I knew I was dealing with something that wasn't human. No person could have thrown a rock that size that distance. My legs went weak. I actually pissed myself a little, just a squirt of fear that I couldn't control. I turned and started running back toward my car, faster than I'd ever run in my life, sprint pace. My lungs burned after just 30 seconds, but adrenaline kept me going. I could hear it crashing through the forest beside me, keeping up effortlessly. The breathing, God, the breathing, deep, rhythmic huffs that didn't sound winded at all. "Leave me alone," I screamed between gasps. "Leave alone," it responded, closer now, maybe only 20 yards away. I risked a glance to my left and saw movement, something large and dark, weaving between trees. I caught a glimpse of what looked like a shoulder, maybe 6 feet off the ground, covered in dark hair or fur. It was bipedal, whatever it was, moving on 2 legs through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. The road curved, and I lost sight of it momentarily. I used the opportunity to push even harder, my quads and calves screaming in protest. When the road straightened again, I couldn't hear it anymore. I dared to hope it had given up. Then I saw it, not in the forest anymore, but on the road ahead of me, standing full in the open, about 100 yards away. I skidded to a stop, nearly falling. It was huge, 7 feet tall at least, broad across the shoulders and chest, covered head to toe in dark brown, almost black hair. Standing upright like a man, but not a man. Its arms hung too long, almost to its knees. Its head sat directly on its shoulders, with barely any neck, and its face. I can hardly describe it. Not quite ape, not quite human. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that I couldn't make out clearly at that distance. But I could feel them watching me, studying me with an intelligence that was terrifying. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then it made a sound. Not a mimicry this time, but something from its own vocabulary. A long, low vocalization that started as a rumble and rose to something like a whoop. It echoed off the cliffs behind me, and I felt it in my chest cavity. Then it stepped sideways into the forest and was gone. Just like that. Something that size shouldn't be able to disappear so completely, so quickly. But it did. I stood frozen for maybe 30 seconds, afraid to move in either direction. Finally, self-preservation kicked in, and I started jogging back toward my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. I didn't hear or see it again, but I felt watched the entire way back. When I finally reached the gate, I squeezed through and sprinted the last quarter mile to my car. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I looked in my rearview mirror at the forest behind me. Nothing visible, but I swear something large moved in the tree line. I drove straight home, locked all my doors and windows, and drank half a bottle of whiskey. Didn't sleep for 2 days. I later found out the Forest Service closed that road completely the following year. They put up a new gate, much harder to get around, with warnings about unstable terrain. But I've always wondered if that was the real reason. That part of the woods feels different from the rest of the gorge. Older somehow, untouched. The area sits directly across from Skamania County in Washington, which literally has laws protecting Bigfoot and hosts a festival celebrating the creature every year. I used to think that was tourist trap nonsense. Not anymore. I've also learned that the Bonneville Dam construction destroyed an ancient Indian burial ground on Bradford Island. I don't know if that's connected, but the local tribes have stories about guardian spirits in those woods that go back centuries. I've never gone back to that trail, never will. I still run, but only in populated areas now. And I never run alone. Sometimes at night, I still hear that voice in my dreams. Hi-yo, hi-yo, hi-yo. Like it's still learning, still practicing. Like someday it might get it right. And sometimes I wonder, what if it did? What if it learned enough to walk among us, to speak like us? Would we even know the difference? Story 9. I've been hunting since I was 10 years old. My grandfather taught me, then my father took over when I was old enough to handle a rifle on my own. I'm now 36, and I've spent more time in the woods than most people have spent at their office jobs. I know every sound, smell, and feeling you get when you're deep in the forest. I know what a bear sounds like when it's digging for grubs. I know what a deer sounds like when it's cautiously moving through underbrush. I know what a coyote sounds like when it's trailing something. But what I heard and saw in November of 2014 in Pisgah National Forest, I have no explanation for that. Even now, years later, I can barely bring myself to talk about it. I'm not crazy, I don't do drugs, I wasn't drunk. I know what I saw. It was November 15th during deer season. The weather was perfect, around 45 degrees, overcast but not raining, with a light breeze coming from the north. I'd taken the day off work specifically because the conditions were so good. I'd been scouting this particular area for weeks and had found a promising spot on a ridge that overlooked a steep ravine. There were deer tracks everywhere, and I'd set up a small ground blind about a week earlier. I arrived at my spot around 2 in the afternoon. It was about a 3-mile hike from where I'd parked my truck, a nice, secluded area away from the more popular hunting grounds. I settled into my blind, got comfortable, and prepared for what I thought would be a normal afternoon hunt. The first 30 minutes were uneventful. Just the usual forest sounds, wind in the trees, squirrels chattering, the occasional bird call. I was starting to zone out a bit, the way you do when you've been sitting still for a while, when I heard the first unusual sound. It was a crashing noise from down in the ravine, like something big moving through the underbrush. My first thought was, buck, and I immediately became alert, my rifle ready. But the crashing continued and got louder. This wasn't the careful movement of a deer. This was something big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I figured it was probably a bear. We have plenty of black bears in these mountains, and while they can be dangerous, they generally leave you alone if you leave them alone. I wasn't worried, just curious. Then I heard it. A deep, guttural roar that echoed through the forest. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. The sound made my skin crawl and the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was primal and powerful, like something from another time. Before I could even process what I'd heard, there was an answering roar from closer by, maybe 100 yards away. My heart started pounding. Whatever was making these sounds, there were two of them, and they sounded angry. The crashing got louder, and I could tell something was moving up the ravine toward my position. I stayed absolutely still, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Through gaps in the underbrush, I caught my first glimpse of, I still don't know what to call it. It was massive. Covered in thick reddish-brown hair, it was moving on two legs, tearing through vegetation like it wasn't even there. Trees that would have stopped me dead in my tracks were pushed aside like they were nothing. As it moved into a slightly clearer area, I got a better look. It had to be at least 9 feet tall. Its chest was enormous, easily twice as wide as mine, and its arms were long, way longer than a human's should be. It moved with incredible speed for something so big, covering ground in huge strides. I was frozen in place. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when the second one appeared. This one came from the opposite direction, moving just as fast but slightly smaller than the first. Its hair was almost black, and it seemed more agile. The two creatures spotted each other, and what happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. They charged straight at each other. The collision was violent, like watching two freight trains crash. They weren't fighting like animals. They were fighting like enraged men. They grappled with each other, using their arms to throw punches and their enormous hands to grab and throw. The reddish one slammed the darker one into a tree with enough force that I heard the wood crack. The tree, a decent-sized oak that probably took 50 years to grow, shook like it had been hit by a car. The darker one roared in pain or rage, then tackled the reddish one, driving it backward through a stand of smaller trees that snapped like twigs. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The strength these things had was unreal. The reddish one picked up the darker one, just picked it up like it weighed nothing, and threw it into a thick laurel patch. The ground literally shook when it landed. I felt the vibration through my boots. The darker one wasn't done, though. It exploded out of the laurels and caught the reddish one in what looked like a bear hug. They spun around, grappling and roaring. The sounds they made were like nothing I've ever heard. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between that made my blood run cold. The fight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. They tore up everything around them. Small trees were uprooted. Rocks were dislodged and rolled down the ravine. At one point, the reddish one threw a boulder. I swear it had to weigh at least 100 pounds. At the darker one, who dodged it like it was a baseball. Eventually, the darker one gained the upper hand. It got behind the reddish one, wrapped those long arms around it, and slammed it down hard onto the forest floor. The impact sent leaves and dirt flying into the air. The reddish one didn't get up immediately, and I thought maybe the fight was over. That's when it happened. The reddish one, still on the ground, turned its head and looked directly at me. Our eyes met across the distance, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. Its face was, I don't know how to describe it. Not exactly human, but not exactly ape either. Its eyes were deep set under a prominent brow, its nose broad and flat. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that terrified me. This wasn't an animal looking at me. This was something that understood what I was, understood that I was watching. Its expression changed when it saw me. I couldn't tell you exactly what emotion I saw, but it wasn't fear, maybe surprise, maybe anger. It stared at me, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The darker one noticed the change and followed its gaze. Now both of them were looking at me. The darker one took a step in my direction, and I saw its mouth open slightly, revealing flat front teeth. Not the fangs of a predator, but something more omnivorous, more human-like. That's when the paralysis that had gripped me finally broke. Pure terror shot through my body, and I ran. I abandoned my rifle, my pack, everything. I just ran in the opposite direction, down the other side of the ridge. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me. Something was following. The ground shook with each impact. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning, my legs pumping on pure adrenaline. I don't know how long I ran or how far. I ended up in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The footsteps had stopped at some point, but I kept going. I eventually found a trail, then another, and finally made it back to a road where I flagged down a passing truck. The driver must have thought I was crazy. I was scratched up, out of breath, and probably looked terrified. He drove me back to my truck, which was miles away from where I ended up. I never went back for my gear. It's still out there as far as I know. I haven't been hunting since. I can barely bring myself to go hiking on well-traveled trails. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was bears. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide from a nearby mine, though I don't think there are any in that area. Maybe I fell asleep and had a vivid nightmare. But deep down, I know what I saw. Two massive bipedal creatures fighting in what they clearly considered their territory. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them, they're real, they're intelligent, and they're incredibly powerful. The thing that haunts me most isn't the size or strength of these creatures. It's the way they looked at me, the recognition in their eyes. They knew what I was. They knew I didn't belong there. I haven't told many people this story. My wife knows. She's the one who convinced me to write it down. A couple close friends know parts of it, but I've never given them the full details. Who would believe it? I barely believe it myself sometimes. But every night when I close my eyes, I see that reddish-brown face staring at me. I see those eyes, and I know that whatever these things are, they're out there, deep in the forests of North Carolina, living their lives, fighting their battles, far from human eyes. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear that roar echoing from the distant mountains, and I know I'll never set foot in those woods again. Story 10. I've been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for years, but what happened to me last October in the Georgia mountains still gives me chills when I think about it. I'm not the type to spook easily. I've had my fair share of wildlife encounters and weird moments in the backcountry, but this was different. I still can't explain it, and part of me doesn't want to try. I had taken a week off work to do a solo section hike in North Georgia. The weather was perfect. Cool mornings, comfortable days, and crisp nights. Fall in the mountains is my favorite time to hike. The leaves were just starting to change, creating this amazing canopy of reds and golds. I'd been on the trail for 3 days, making good progress and enjoying the solitude. That afternoon, I set up camp about a mile from the Hawk Mountain shelter. It was a nice little spot. Flat ground, close to a small stream for water, and far enough off the trail that I wouldn't be disturbed by other hikers passing by. I wasn't planning to stay at the shelter that night, because I generally prefer my solitude when I'm out there, plus the weather report was clear, and I was looking forward to sleeping under the stars. I got my tent up, filtered some water, and started preparing dinner around 4:30. Nothing fancy, just some dehydrated pasta I was rehydrating on my little camp stove. Everything was normal. But as the sun started to dip lower, something changed. It's hard to describe exactly what happened. The woods just felt different. At first I thought maybe a storm was rolling in. You know that feeling when the air pressure changes and everything gets still? But the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. The birds stopped singing. I didn't notice it right away, but once I did, the silence was deafening. Even the constant background noise of insects seemed to fade away. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. I kept looking around, trying to spot whatever might have spooked the wildlife. Maybe a bobcat or a black bear nearby, but I couldn't see anything out of place, just trees and underbrush, completely still in the evening light. I remembered a conversation I'd had with another hiker at a road crossing the day before. He mentioned there were quite a few people staying at Hawk Mountain Shelter. Normally I'd have stuck it out. I'm not one to pack up camp because of a weird feeling, but something just felt wrong, really wrong. My gut was practically screaming at me to get out of there. I decided to listen to that instinct. I quickly packed up my gear, leaving my half-eaten dinner cooling in its pouch. It took me about 15 minutes to break camp, which is probably a personal record. The whole time, that feeling of being watched just intensified. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my tent into its bag. With my pack on and headlamp ready, though it wasn't quite dark enough to need it yet, I started making my way toward the shelter. The trail was pretty clear, but I was moving faster than I should have been for the fading light. I'd gone maybe 50 yards from my campsite when I heard it, a loud crashing sound in the brush to my right. Something big was moving, and it was moving fast. The sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves seemed to explode in the quiet forest. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Whatever it was heading down a steep slope away from the trail. The crashing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then silence again. My first thought was bear. Had to be. But the way it moved. Bears usually don't run like that unless they're scared. And what would have scared a bear? Me, I hadn't made that much noise approaching. I stood there for a minute listening. Nothing. Just my own breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. I clicked on my headlamp even though there was still some light left and picked up my pace. No way was I turning back now. The rest of the hike to the shelter was uneventful, but I couldn't shake that feeling of wrongness. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees with my light. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I reached Hawk Mountain Shelter just as true darkness was setting in. The relief I felt seeing the wooden structure and the glow of headlamps was indescribable. There were 4 other hikers already there. 2 older guys doing a section hike like me, and a young couple who were through hiking southbound. I must have looked pretty rattled because one of the older guys, Tom, I think his name was, asked if I was okay. I told them about moving my camp and the crashing in the brush. They all assumed it was a bear, which made sense. Black bears are common in those mountains. Tom said I'd made the right call coming to the shelter, especially hiking alone. We talked for a while around a small fire someone had built in the fire ring. The conversation eventually turned to other topics, and by the time we all turned in around 9:30, I was feeling much calmer. I set up my sleeping bag on the shelter's wooden floor, away from the edge. The night was clear and cool, perfect for sleeping. I dozed off pretty quickly, exhausted from the day's hike and the adrenaline crash. I don't know exactly how long I slept, but my watch said it was about 5:30 in the morning when I woke up. What woke me wasn't subtle. It was a howl, loud, high-pitched, and unlike anything I've ever heard before. It echoed through the woods, seeming to come from the direction of my abandoned campsite. It wasn't a wolf. I've heard wolves howl in Yellowstone, and this was nothing like that. It wasn't a coyote either. The pitch was too high, almost, I don't know, almost human in a way, but not quite. It had this weird oscillation to it, like it was shifting between 2 different tones. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my heart pounding. I was sitting bolt upright in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, straining to hear anything else. Then it came again. A second call, similar to the first, but from much further away. Like something was answering the first call. This one was fainter, but still clear enough to make out that same unsettling quality. I wasn't the only one who heard it. The other hikers were awake too. One of the older guys whispered, "What the hell was that?" No one had an answer. We all sat there in the dark, listening. Nothing else came. No more calls, no crashing through the underbrush. Just the normal sounds of the forest, slowly returning as dawn approached. A few early birds, the rustling of small animals. None of us went back to sleep. We just sat there, talking in low voices, speculating about what we'd heard. Bears don't make sounds like that. Cougars can scream, but this wasn't that either. One guy suggested it might be someone messing with us. But who would hike miles into the backcountry in the middle of the night just to make weird noises? As soon as there was enough light to see the trail, I packed up and left. I couldn't stay there another night, not after what I'd heard. The other hikers were spooked too. Everyone was packing up early. I hiked 8 miles that day, constantly looking over my shoulder, analyzing every sound in the forest. My mind kept replaying that howl, trying to match it to something I knew. Nothing fit. I've spent a lot of time outdoors. I know what bears sound like. I know what coyotes and bobcats and owls sound like. This wasn't any of those. It wasn't any animal I've ever encountered or even heard of. Here's the thing that really gets me. As I was hiking out that day, I kept thinking about the legends. You know the ones. Stories about creatures in the woods that aren't supposed to exist. I've always written those off as campfire tales, the kind of thing you tell to scare your friends. I'm not saying that's what I heard. I'm really not. But I can't explain it either. I've told this story to a few friends and they all say the same thing. It was probably just some animal I didn't recognize, maybe something with a weird echo in the mountains. Maybe they're right, but they weren't there. They didn't feel that stillness in the forest before it happened. They didn't hear that sound, that howl that seemed to come from something that understood what it was doing. It's been 6 months, and I still go hiking. I'm not going to let one weird experience ruin something I love. But I don't solo camp anymore, at least not in those mountains. And sometimes, when I'm lying in my tent at night and the woods go quiet, I find myself holding my breath, listening for that sound again. I don't know what was in those woods that night. Part of me doesn't want to know. But another part can't stop wondering, if it wasn't anything I can identify, what the hell was it? Story 11. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. It's been 30 years, but I can still feel that chill running down my spine when I think about it. This happened back in the spring of 1993 when I was 13. My family decided to take a day trip to Applegate Lake, which is about 16 miles outside of Medford, Oregon. It was me, my parents, my brother Randy, my grandmother, and our dog Hey Girl. She was a chocolate lab mix, sweetest dog you'd ever meet, never scared of anything. The plan was to hike Collins Mountain Trail that goes around the lake and ends at Cooking Greens Campground and Seattle Bar Lake. It was a perfect spring day, not too hot, not too cold, the kind of day where you think nothing could possibly go wrong. We packed lunches, had our water bottles, and were all excited to get out into nature after being cooped up all winter. My dad kept talking about fishing spots he wanted to check out along the way, and my mom was pointing out different birds. My grandmother, who we all called Nana, was just happy to be with us. She was still pretty spry back then and loved hiking. We pulled into the trailhead parking lot around 10 in the morning. There were only a couple other cars there, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. I remember my dad saying something about how we'd have the trail mostly to ourselves. We got our backpacks ready, made sure Hey Girl's leash was secure, and started down the path. The trail started off pretty normal, dirt path, some rocks, trees all around. The lake was visible through the trees on one side, and the mountain rose up on the other. Randy and I were taking turns, throwing a stick for Hey Girl to chase. She was having a blast, running ahead and then back to us, tongue hanging out, tail wagging like crazy. We couldn't have been more than a quarter mile in when everything changed. Hey Girl suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. Her ears perked up and she started sniffing the air frantically. I called to her, but she wouldn't come. Then her whole body tensed up, and she let out this whimper I'd never heard from her before. Before any of us could grab her, she bolted, not forward on the trail, but straight back toward the parking lot, crying and yelping the whole way. My dad was like, "What the hell?" He tried calling her, but she was gone, racing back to our truck. We could hear her barking in the distance. Mom was worried she might run into the road, so my dad headed back to get her, while the rest of us waited on the trail. I was curious about what had spooked her so badly. Hey Girl wasn't the kind of dog to get scared over nothing. She'd chase after bears if we let her. So while everyone was distracted, I wandered a few feet off the trail to look around. That's when I saw them. About 12 feet off the trail, partially hidden by some ferns, was a line of footprints, but not normal footprints. These were huge. At first I thought maybe someone was playing a joke, you know, like someone with those fake Bigfoot feet you can buy at joke shops. But as I got closer, I could tell these were no joke. The ground wasn't muddy or anything. It was pretty firm, actually. But these prints were sunk deep into it. The front part was pressed down about 1.5 inches, and the heel was even deeper, like 3 inches down. Whatever made these prints was heavy. I crouched down next to one and just stared at it. It was shaped like a human foot, but massive, at least 16 inches long, maybe more. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them spread wide apart. There was no shoe pattern, no boot treads, nothing but what looked like bare skin impressions. What really got me was the stride length. I counted 8 clear prints in a row, heading off toward a marshy creek area. The distance between each one was crazy, like 1.5 times what a normal person's stride would be, maybe more. I tried to stretch my legs to match the distance and couldn't come close. "Lucas, where'd you go?" My mum was calling me. "Over here!" I shouted back. "You guys need to see this!" Randy came over first, then Mom. They both just stood there, not saying anything at first. Then Randy whispered, "Holy crap." My grandmother had been hanging back on the trail, but when she heard us all talking in hushed voices, she came over too. That's when something weird happened. She took one look at those footprints and her face changed. Not scared exactly. More like resigned, like she wasn't surprised at all. "Nana, look at these footprints," I said, pointing at them. "They're huge." She just nodded slowly and said, "I've seen such things before." Then she looked around at the woods, her eyes narrowing. "I think we should leave." That was it. No explanation, no surprise, nothing. Just, "I've seen such things before, and we should leave." I wanted to ask her more, but something in her expression stopped me. We heard my dad coming back up the trail with Hey Girl. He had her in his arms because she refused to walk. Her whole body was trembling and she kept making these little whimpering sounds. Dad was out of breath from carrying a 60-pound dog. "She was hiding under the truck," he said. "Wouldn't come out for anything. I had to crawl under there and drag her out. What the hell spooked her so bad?" Mom pointed to the footprints. Dad put Hey Girl down. She immediately pressed herself against his legs and walked over to look. He's not the kind of guy who gets rattled easily, but I saw his face go pale. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. He looked up, scanning the woods around us. "Where do they lead?" I pointed toward the creek marsh area. "That way. There's at least 8 of them that I can see." As we all stood there, staring at the prints, we heard it, the sound of branches snapping and brush being pushed aside, coming from the direction the prints were headed, not like a squirrel or even a deer moving through the woods. This was loud. Whatever was making that noise was big and heavy and not trying to be quiet. Randy grabbed my arm. "Lucas," he whispered, "something's out there." Dad slowly straightened up. "Everyone back to the trail," he said, his voice low and steady. "Now." We backed away from the prints, no one wanting to turn their back on the woods. Hey Girl was pressing so hard against Dad's legs that he almost tripped. That's when we heard the call. I don't know how to describe it properly. It wasn't like anything I've ever heard before or since. It started low, then rose in pitch. kind of like a bird call, but much deeper and louder. But also, not like a bird at all. There was something almost monkey-like about it, but not quite that either. It echoed up the trail, bouncing off the trees, making it hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. It wasn't a normal forest sound. Everyone knew it instantly. Whatever made that sound was not supposed to be in an Oregon forest. Hey Girl went berserk. She started barking and howling, her hackles raised, still trembling but now trying to both hide behind Dad and lunge toward the sound at the same time. Dad had to grab her collar to hold her back. We're leaving now. Dad's voice left no room for argument. But what about our hike? Randy asked, though his face showed he didn't really want to stay either. Not today, Mum said firmly. I looked at Nana, expecting her to be scared, but she just had this grim look on her face. I told you, she said quietly to me. Some things are best left alone. As we hurried back toward the parking lot, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but I could feel it. We were being watched. The sensation of eyes on my back was so strong, I kept getting goosebumps. We were maybe halfway back to the car when we heard the call again, closer this time. It was followed by more crashing sounds in the underbrush, like something big was moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us, but staying hidden in the trees. We didn't walk after that. We ran. All of us. Even Nana, who moved faster than I'd ever seen her move before. Hey Girl was out front, pulling Dad by the leash, desperate to get back to the truck. When we finally reached the parking lot, we piled into the truck so fast we were practically climbing over each other. Dad started the engine and we peeled out of there, gravel flying. No one spoke for the first few miles. Then Randy said what we were all thinking. That was a Bigfoot, wasn't it? Dad, who's normally skeptical about everything, didn't immediately say no. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter and said, I don't know what it was, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I've ever encountered before. Mum turned around in her seat to look at us kids. Whatever it was, we're safe now. But Nana, sitting next to me in the back seat, just stared out the window and murmured, for now. I nudged her gently. Nana, what did you mean before, when you said you'd seen things like this? She sighed deeply. There are things in these forests that most people never see. Your grandfather and I, we had an encounter back in 1958, up near Mount Hood. Never told anyone outside the family. No one would believe it anyway. She wouldn't say more than that, no matter how much I pressed. When we got home, Hey Girl wouldn't leave the house for 3 days. She'd go to the door, sniff the air, then back away whining. It took weeks before she'd go into our backyard without one of us right beside her. I tried researching Bigfoot sightings around Applegate Lake after that. Turns out there have been dozens of reports over the years. Strange footprints, weird calls at night, even a few claimed sightings, most from the areas around Collins Mountain and the marshlands. That was 30 years ago, and I've never gone back to Applegate Lake. My family doesn't talk about what happened that day. When I bring it up, everyone gets uncomfortable and changes the subject, even Randy, who was right there with me. But I know what I saw. Those footprints were real. That call was real, and whatever was watching us from the woods that day was real too. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that strange call echoing in my dreams. And I wonder if it's still out there, in the forests surrounding Applegate Lake, watching and waiting for the next hikers to wander a little too far off the trail. Story 12. I've never been much of a storyteller, but I need to get this off my chest. It's been over 20 years now, and I still wake up some nights with the same image burned into my mind. I've only told a few people about what happened that day in the Everglades, and most just give me that look. You know the one, like I'm either crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw. It was early August, 2002. I had just turned 35 and decided to treat myself to a solo fishing trip in the deep Everglades. I'm talking about the real Everglades, not those tourist airboat rides where they feed hot dogs to gators. I'm talking about 10 miles from the nearest paved road, where the only sounds are birds, bugs, and the occasional splash of something in the water. I had this small, flat-bottom boat. Nothing fancy, just a 14-footer with a small outboard that could navigate the shallow waters. I launched before sunrise, around 5:30 in the morning. The air was already thick with humidity, but there was still that morning coolness that makes early starts worth it. I remember the mosquitoes were absolutely brutal that year, so I doused myself in that stinky repellent that never quite works as well as advertised. The plan was simple: fish until mid-afternoon, then head back before the daily thunderstorms rolled in. I'd packed sandwiches, plenty of water, and enough tackle to handle whatever might bite. I'd been to this particular area several times before, a network of narrow channels winding through cypress stands, sawgrass prairies, and mangrove clusters. It's prime fishing territory, if you know where to look, especially for largemouth bass and bowfin. The morning went well. I caught a few decent-sized bass, lost what might have been a trophy, and generally enjoyed the solitude. By noon, I had anchored in this narrow channel, maybe 20 feet across, that was lined with cypress knees and hanging moss. The water was that typical Everglades color, dark tea from all the tannins, where you can only see a few inches below the surface. The sun was directly overhead, beating down mercilessly. I remember taking off my cap to wipe sweat from my forehead when I first noticed something was off. It's hard to explain if you've never spent time in wild places. But there's a certain background noise you get used to. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of vegetation in the breeze. Suddenly, all that just stopped. The silence hit me like a physical thing. No bird calls, no insect drone, nothing. At first, I thought maybe a gator was nearby. They can sometimes cause smaller creatures to go quiet, but this felt different, more complete, more intentional somehow. I set my rod down and just listened, trying to figure out what had changed. That's when I noticed small ripples disturbing the surface of the water, not coming from my boat, but from around the bend in the channel about 30 yards ahead. These weren't the little rings you see when small fish are active. These were bigger, more deliberate, like something substantial was moving through the water without trying to make a splash. I sat completely still, partly out of curiosity, partly from a growing uneasiness I couldn't explain. Then I heard it, heavy splashing around the bend, out of sight. Not the tail slap of a gator or the jump of a fish. This was the sound of something massive displacing water, something walking. I've hunted and fished my entire life. I know what deer sound like crossing water. I know what bears sound like. This was neither. The footfalls were too deliberate, too heavy, and too widely spaced. Then the vegetation started moving, not the gentle swaying from a breeze, but the forceful parting of thick brush. Something big was coming through. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I have a .38 revolver in my tackle box. I always carry it for snakes and the occasional aggressive gator. But I couldn't move to reach for it. I just sat there, watching, as something emerged from around the bend. What stepped out of the dense brush and into the water was unlike anything I've ever seen before or since. It was a creature that stood fully upright on two legs, easily 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was covered in dark brown hair, soaking wet and hanging in thick matted strands from its massive arms and back. Let me be clear, this was not a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. Bears don't move like this. This thing walked upright with purpose, with a stride that was unmistakably hominid, but far larger than any human. It waded into the channel, the water only reaching its waist. That's when I got my clearest view of it. The muscle definition was visible even through the wet hair. The shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering to a narrower waist. Its arms hung longer than a human's would, with massive hands that seemed capable of uprooting small trees. But it was the head that I still see in my dreams. Set low on those enormous shoulders was a large, somewhat conical head with what I can only describe as a face, not an animal's snout or muzzle, but a face. The skin was dark, almost black, with deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge. The nose was flat and wide, the mouth a grim line. I couldn't make out many details of the features at that distance, but what struck me most was how aware it looked. There was intelligence in its movements, in the way it scanned its surroundings. I was downwind from it, thank God, and partially shaded by an overhanging cypress. It hadn't noticed me, or if it had, it wasn't concerned. It moved with the confidence of something that knew it had nothing to fear in these swamps. The creature was breathing heavily, not like it was exhausted, but deep, powerful breaths that I could hear clearly across the water. Each exhale made a soft, huffing sound that carried in the dead silence of the swamp. When it reached the middle of the channel, it paused for just a moment, as if listening. I swear it tilted its head slightly, the way people do when they're trying to pick up a distant sound. In that moment, I didn't dare breathe. My hand was frozen on my fishing rod, my body pressed as far back in my seat as it would go. Then it continued its crossing, moving with surprising grace for something so massive. The water barely seemed to impede its progress. When it reached the opposite bank, it stepped up into a patch of sunlight filtering through the canopy, and that's when I got my absolute clearest view. In that shaft of sunlight, with water streaming off its body, I could see every detail. The hair wasn't a uniform color, but varied from dark chocolate to almost black in places, especially on its back and shoulders. Where the sun hit directly, there was almost a reddish tint to it. Its proportions were just wrong for anything I recognized. The shoulders too wide, the arms too long, the legs too powerful. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. It reached up and grabbed a low-hanging branch, effortlessly pulling it down to grab something. Fruit or leaves, I couldn't tell. Then it turned slightly, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought it was looking right at me. I've never felt smaller or more vulnerable than I did in that instant. Here I was, miles from any help, face to face with something that could tear me apart without breaking a sweat. But it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't acting predatory, it was just existing, moving through its environment with the casual confidence of something that belonged there. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it pushed through the vegetation on the far bank and was gone. The massive fronds and branches swayed with its passing for a few moments, then went still. I sat there, completely frozen, for what must have been 15 minutes. I was afraid to start my motor, afraid it might come back if I made noise. Eventually, I worked up the courage to pull up my anchor, moving as slowly and quietly as I could, and used my paddle to back out of that channel. Only when I was a good distance away did I finally start the outboard, and even then, I kept it at the lowest possible speed until I was well clear of the area. The whole way back to the boat ramp, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the banks for any sign of movement. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely steer. I've never been so grateful to see a parking lot and other people in my life. When I got home, I took the longest shower of my life, trying to wash away the feeling of being watched that had settled into my bones. I didn't tell my wife right away. How do you even start that conversation? Hey, honey, guess what I saw today? A Sasquatch taking a stroll through the swamp. Over the next few weeks, I did some research, found out what I'd seen matches descriptions of what locals call the skunk ape or swamp ape, Florida's version of Bigfoot. The few grainy photos I found online didn't do justice to what I'd witnessed, but they were similar enough to send chills down my spine. I've gone back to the Everglades many times since then. It's still some of the best fishing in Florida, but never alone, and never to that specific area. I can't bring myself to go back there. Some nights I still jolt awake, my brain replaying those moments in perfect detail. The silence, The ripples on the water, the massive figure moving with such purpose through a landscape most humans can barely navigate. What haunts me most isn't fear. It's the realization that there are things out there living alongside us that we pretend don't exist. That creature wasn't some lost or confused animal. It moved through that swamp like it owned it, like its ancestors had been there long before humans ever set foot in Florida. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw. And the Everglades? They're a lot bigger and a lot wilder than most people realize. There's plenty of room out there for things to hide, especially things that don't want to be found. Story 13. I still haven't told many people about what happened on my property back in October 2001. Most would think I'm crazy or looking for attention, but it's been over 20 years now, and I still get chills thinking about it. I need to get this off my chest. I own a 15-acre piece of land outside Enterprise, Oregon. It's mostly wooded with some cleared areas where I keep a small barn and a modest house. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I've always loved the isolation, no nosy neighbors, just me, my 2 German shepherds, Bear and Ranger, and the wildlife. That October evening started like any other. It was getting dark earlier, and there was a bite in the air that told me winter wasn't far off. I'd spent the afternoon splitting firewood, getting ready for the cold months ahead. The dogs had been with me all day, running around the property like they always did. But when the sun started to set, something changed. Bear and Ranger both came racing back to the house. At first I thought they were just tired, but when I went to let them out again after dinner, they refused to go. They stood at the threshold, hackles raised, whining. These weren't timid dogs. They'd chase off coyotes and had even stood their ground against a black bear once, but something had them spooked. "What's wrong with you two?" I asked, trying to coax them out. Bear just looked at me and whined louder. Ranger paced nervously, occasionally glancing toward the direction of the barn. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket. If something was out there threatening my property, I needed to know what it was. "Fine. You chickens stay here," I told the dogs as I closed the door behind me. The night was clear and cold, with the half-moon providing just enough light to see the outlines of the trees and the barn about 100 yards away. My breath clouded in front of me as I walked, and the silence felt heavy. Usually there'd be the sounds of night creatures, owls, the rustling of small animals. But that night, everything was quiet. I was about halfway to the barn when I heard it. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground, coming from behind the structure. My first thought was that maybe a cougar had taken down a deer and was dragging it away. It wouldn't be unheard of, though cougars usually don't come this close to human dwellings. The smart thing would have been to go back to the house and get my rifle. But curiosity got the better of me, and I approached slowly, keeping the beam of my flashlight low to the ground. As I got closer, I heard something else, breathing, deep, heavy breathing, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the panting of a dog or the snorting of a deer. It was measured, deliberate, and unnervingly human-like, but deeper, more powerful. I rounded the corner of the barn, and that's when I saw it. The creature was enormous, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. Its back was to me, but I could see it was covered in dark, shaggy hair, with broad shoulders and arms that hung longer than a human's would. In one of those long arms, it gripped the carcass of an adult buck deer, dragging it as if it weighed nothing more than a sack of flour. I stood frozen, my brain unable to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright that long, and they don't have that posture. This was something else entirely. Then I made a fatal mistake. I gasped. The sound barely escaped my lips, but in the silence of that night it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature stopped. The breathing paused, and then slowly it turned. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. A wide face with a pronounced brow ridge, a flat nose, and deep-set eyes that caught the beam of my flashlight and reflected back with a reddish glow. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that looked yellowed and strong. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, and my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. The creature, and I know how this sounds, but there's no other word for it, a Sasquatch, dropped the deer carcass. It straightened up to its full height, towering over me. Then it did something that sent ice through my veins. It let out a low, rumbling growl. Not like a dog or a bear. It was deeper, more resonant, like it came from somewhere ancient and primal. It took a step toward me. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see if it was following me. All I could think was getting back to the house, to safety. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face as I sprinted through the darkness, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. I burst through my front door, slammed it shut, and locked it. Bear and Ranger were going crazy, barking and whining, pressing themselves against my legs. I grabbed my rifle from the gun cabinet and loaded it with shaking hands, then closed all the blinds and sat in my living room, gun across my lap, dogs at my feet, listening. Nothing came, no footsteps on the porch, no attempt to break in. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind made me jump. The dogs eventually calmed down enough to lie down, but they remained alert, heads up, ears perked at the slightest sound. When dawn finally broke, I was still sitting there, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside, rifle in hand. The dogs refused to follow me, which only amplified my anxiety. The first thing I checked was the barn. Nothing seemed disturbed there. Then I walked to where I'd seen the creature the night before. Clear as day, there were drag marks in the dirt and grass. Something heavy had been pulled from the woods to behind my barn, and then in a different direction. I followed the drag marks. They led toward the tree line at the edge of my property, about 100 yards from the barn. As I approached the woods, I found what I was looking for, or at least part of it. The remains of the deer lay about 30 yards into the trees. It had been processed, is the only word I can think of. The ribs were picked clean, the spine was snapped in multiple places, and one of the back legs was missing entirely. The head was still intact, but the antlers had been broken off at the base. Around the carcass were footprints, not human footprints, and not bear prints either. They were huge. I measured them with my hand, which is about 9 inches long from wrist to fingertip. These prints were easily 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. They had 5 toes like a human foot, but wider, with a distinctive arch. I took photos with my old Polaroid camera. I still have them somewhere, though they've faded over the years. I should have reported it, I guess. But to who? The sheriff would think I was nuts. Forest Service would probably say the same, and I didn't want strangers tramping all over my property, treating me like some kook who saw Bigfoot. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, things got stranger. The dogs absolutely refused to go outside after dark. They do their business right by the porch in the daytime and then race back inside. At night, they'd growl at the windows, especially the ones facing the woods. 3 days after the initial encounter, I found deep gouges in one of the trees near my pasture. They were claw marks, about 7 feet up the trunk, higher than a bear could reach on all fours, and not the right pattern for a bear anyway. These were 4 parallel lines, like someone had run their fingers down the bark, except with enough force to gouge out chunks of wood. At night, I'd hear movement in the woods, not just the usual forest sounds, but heavy footsteps, branches breaking under significant weight. Sometimes, I'd hear that growl again, low, warning, territorial. It always seemed to come from different directions, like whatever made it was circling my property, patrolling. The most disturbing thing happened about a week after I first saw the creature. I went out to feed my chickens in the morning and found a small, neat pile of bones stacked by the side of the barn. They were small, probably from rabbits or squirrels, but they were deliberately arranged, not scattered like you'd expect if an animal had left them. It looked intentional, like a message. The next morning, the bone pile was gone. Not scattered, not dragged away, just gone as if someone had picked them up. I never saw the creature in full again, but I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees, something too large to be a deer, too upright to be a bear. Sometimes at dusk, I'd feel like I was being watched. I'd look toward the tree line and see nothing, but the feeling would persist. The wildlife on my property changed too. For weeks after the encounter, birds avoided the area where I'd found the deer remains. Deer, which used to graze in my pasture regularly, stayed away entirely. It was like everything recognized that a new apex predator had claimed territory. I still live on that same property. The encounters tapered off after a few months, and things gradually returned to normal, or a new normal anyway. I don't split wood after dark anymore. I installed better security lights around the house and barn. I got a new dog after Bear and Ranger passed. They lived good long lives, but this one stays inside at night, no exceptions. Sometimes, on winter nights, when the wind blows through the trees just right, I think I hear that breathing again. Deep, measured, powerful. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. If it considers this its territory as much as I consider it mine. I've learned to live with the knowledge that there are things in this world we don't understand. Things that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. I don't talk about it much. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. And sometimes, I think it knows me too. Story 14. I've hunted all my life. Started going out with my dad when I was just 10 years old, and I've been doing it every season for the past 23 years. I've seen bears, cougars, and all kinds of wildlife up close. I've been in some hairy situations, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me last October in the Ooco National Forest. I'm still trying to make sense of it. I've told exactly 3 people about this. My wife, my brother, and my hunting buddy Kevin. My wife thinks I need therapy. My brother believes me, but says I should keep it to myself. And Kevin, well, Kevin's the reason I'm finally writing this down. He said sharing it might help me process what happened, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It was October 14th, 2023, elk season. I'd spent months preparing, studying maps, checking game cameras. I found this perfect spot deep in the Ooco, way off the main trails, about 11 miles from the nearest access road, the kind of place most hunters won't bother hiking to. 2 days before, I'd packed in my climbing tree stand and set it up on this massive ponderosa that gave me a great view of a natural funnel where 2 ridges met. That morning, I got to my stand well before dawn. It was cold, maybe 35 degrees, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional owl. I climbed up about 15 feet, secured myself, and settled in. The sun came up around 7, and I spent the next few hours just watching, occasionally making some soft cow calls. It was around 1 in the afternoon when everything changed, and I mean everything. 1 minute the forest was alive, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, normal forest sounds. Then, like someone flipped a switch, dead silence. At first, I thought maybe a cougar was moving through the area. That happens sometimes. Predator moves in, everything goes quiet, but this was different. The silence felt heavy, wrong somehow. I was scanning the area when movement caught my eye off to my right, on the opposing slope about 60 yards away. Something dark was standing between 2 trees. My first thought was bear, because what else would it be? But then it stepped forward, and I realized I wasn't looking at a bear. This thing was standing upright, completely upright, on two legs. I've seen plenty of bears stand up briefly, but they always go back down on all fours to move. This didn't. It walked forward on two legs, stepping deliberately, moving like a person would move, except it wasn't a person. No way in hell. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say its shoulders must have been at least 4 feet across. It was covered in thick, reddish-brown hair, not fur like a bear, but more like long hair that moved with the breeze. The hair was darker on its back and lighter on its chest and face. I couldn't make out its features clearly at that distance, but I could see its mass, its outline, and I could see it breathing, its chest visibly rising and falling. I sat completely still. My rifle was across my lap, but I never even thought about raising it. Something deep inside me knew that would be a terrible idea. Instead, I just watched, barely breathing, as this thing surveyed the valley below. Then I heard it, a branch snapping behind me. Slowly, very slowly, I turned my head to look over my left shoulder, and that's when my blood turned to ice. There was a second one. This one was closer, maybe 30 yards behind my tree. It was darker than the first, almost black, and it was standing partially behind a thick fir, just watching me. I don't know how long it had been there, but it was clear it knew exactly where I was. I was trapped between them, one in front, one behind. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These things had me surrounded. They'd coordinated somehow. They knew I was there, and they'd positioned themselves strategically, one to distract me while the other circled behind. The first one, the reddish one, moved downhill into some thick brush, disappearing from view. I strained to see where it went, but it was just gone. 1,500 pounds of whatever the hell it was vanished into brush that wouldn't hide a deer. Then came a sound from behind me that I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling grunt. Not like an elk or a bear. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like someone trying to imitate a bear, but with a human vocal cord. It was followed by a loud crack that echoed through the valley, like something had struck a tree with incredible force. I nearly jumped out of my stand. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my eyeballs. I didn't dare move. I just sat there, barely breathing, desperately hoping these things would lose interest and move on. They didn't. For the next 4 hours, they stayed in the area. I never saw the reddish one again, but I'd occasionally hear movement in the brush below. The dark one behind me would move from tree to tree, never fully exposing itself, but making sure I knew it was there. Every 20 minutes or so, there'd be another grunt or another tree strike. They were testing me, or warning me, or just fucking with me. I don't know. The worst part was the intelligence behind it all. These weren't animals acting on instinct. The way they coordinated, the way they kept me pinned down without ever directly threatening me, it was calculated, deliberate. They were smart, and they were letting me know it. As the sun started to set, the forest grew quiet again. No more grunts, no more movement that I could detect. But I still didn't move. I sat in that stand until it was almost completely dark, maybe 6:30 or 7. My body was stiff. My bladder was about to burst. I'd been too terrified to pee off the side of the stand, and I was shivering from both cold and fear. Finally, I knew I had to get down. I couldn't spend the night up there. Hypothermia would get me if nothing else did. I unclipped my safety harness with shaking hands and started my climb down, straining to hear anything in the darkness around me. I made it to the ground and immediately pressed my back against the tree, scanning with my headlamp. Nothing moved. I pulled out my sidearm, a Glock 20 that I suddenly wished was a lot bigger, and started walking, not running, though everything in me wanted to sprint. running triggers, predatory instincts, and I wasn't about to do that. I walked the entire 11 miles back to my truck in the dark. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, weapon raised. I've never been so terrified in my life. I kept thinking they were following me, staying just outside my light's reach. By the time I reached my truck around midnight, my legs were rubber, and I was practically delirious from stress and exhaustion. I didn't sleep that night. I drove to the nearest town, checked into a motel, and sat awake until dawn, replaying everything in my mind. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was it just bears? Was I losing my mind? The next morning, against all better judgment, I went back. Not alone, I convinced Kevin to come with me, though I didn't tell him exactly what had happened. Just that I'd seen something strange and wanted backup to retrieve my stand. We hiked in around 9 in the morning. The forest seemed normal again, birds singing, squirrels chattering. But when we reached my tree, the evidence was right there in front of us. The ground around the base of my tree was torn up, not like a deer scrape or bear dig, but like something had deliberately raked the soil. There were several distinct depressions that, while not clear footprints, were definitely made by something large and heavy, and 2 nearby trees had fresh bark scrapes about 6 feet off the ground, right where the dark one had been circling. Kevin saw it too. He didn't say much, just, "What the hell did this?" I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I thought. I just mumbled something about maybe a bear marking territory. We took down my stand in record time and got the hell out of there. It's been almost a year, and I still haven't gone back to that part of the Ooco. I've hunted other areas, but something in me changed that day. The forest doesn't feel the same anymore. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning ridgelines, listening for that unnatural silence that precedes them. I don't know what they were. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. All I know is they were real. They were intelligent, and they were coordinated in a way that still chills me to the bone. The way they positioned themselves, one in front, one behind, wasn't random. They were communicating somehow, working together, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I always thought I understood the natural order of things. Now I know better. There's something else out there, something that understands us better than we understand them, something that can disappear into the landscape like a ghost when it wants to. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods now, I still get that feeling, that heavy silence, that sense of being watched. And I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting, deciding whether to make themselves known again. Story 15. I never thought I'd be the one posting something like this. Honestly, I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that day, wondering if I should tell anyone. Most people would think I'm crazy, and maybe I am, but I know what I saw. It was May 17th. 1989. That date is burned into my memory forever. I was 32 then, working at a small accounting firm in Pasadena. The spring had been unusually stressful. Tax season had stretched beyond April, and I desperately needed some time alone with my thoughts. I'd been hiking the foothills above Pasadena for years. Those mountains were my sanctuary when life got too noisy. That day, I left work early, around 3 in the afternoon, and drove up to one of my favorite trailheads. The weather was perfect, about 75 degrees with a light breeze, not too hot for mid-May. I remember parking my Honda Civic in the small dirt lot. Only 2 other cars were there, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday afternoon. I grabbed my day pack with my water bottle, trail mix, and a light jacket in case it got cool later. I didn't plan on staying until dark, but I always came prepared. The trail started off like any other hike. I passed a couple heading back to the parking lot, nodding hello as we crossed paths. After that, I had the mountain to myself, or so I thought. The chaparral was thick that year due to good winter rains, and wildflowers dotted the trail edges. I remember yellow monkey flowers and purple lupines everywhere. About 45 minutes in, around 5 o'clock, I stopped to take a drink of water. That's when I first noticed something was off. The birds had gone quiet. If you spend enough time outdoors, you learn to pay attention to these things. Nature has a way of warning you when something isn't right. I stood there, water bottle halfway to my lips, listening. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Not animal footsteps, not the light rustling of a squirrel or even a deer. These were heavy, deliberate steps moving through the brush maybe 50 yards off the trail to my right. My first thought was another hiker had gone off trail, but that didn't make sense. The chaparral was too dense to move through easily, and why would someone struggle through it when there was a perfectly good trail? I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" No response, just silence. Then more footsteps, moving parallel to the trail I was on. I decided to keep going, hiking a bit faster than before. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was hearing things. Then a small rock landed on the trail about 10 feet ahead of me. I stopped, dead in my tracks. The rock hadn't fallen naturally. It had been thrown from the slope above. I scanned the hillside but saw nothing but scrub oak and manzanita. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't funny." Again, no answer. Just the wind and my own quickened breathing. I should have turned back then. Every instinct told me to. But instead I kept going, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I told myself I was being ridiculous. Mountain lions don't throw rocks, neither do bears. It had to be kids messing around, I thought. The trail switchbacked up a steep section, and I pushed myself harder than usual, wanting to get to the ridge where I could see more of my surroundings. When I reached the top, I paused to catch my breath. The view was spectacular. The San Gabriel Valley spread out below, the city of Pasadena looking tiny from this height. For a moment, I forgot about the strange noises. The ridge trail was narrow but well-defined. I followed it for another 20 minutes until it reached a T-junction with another path. I checked my watch. It was getting close to 6, and I needed to head back soon to beat sunset. I took a quick drink, ate a handful of trail mix, and started my return journey. That's when everything changed. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile back down the ridge trail when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead of me on the path was something, someone, a figure. At first I thought it was another hiker, but as I squinted against the late afternoon sun, I realized this was no hiker. It was tall, at least 6 feet, maybe more, and it was covered in black hair. Not clothing. Hair, thick shaggy black hair all over its body. It was moving strangely on the trail, almost like it was dancing. That's the only word I can use to describe it. It was stepping side to side across the width of the trail, arms outstretched, swaying back and forth. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Was it a person in a costume? But who would wear something like that while hiking alone in the mountains? And why? I stood frozen, not sure whether to run back the way I'd come or continue forward. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, didn't seem to notice me at first. It continued its strange movement, almost playful in its actions. Something came over me then. I'm not normally impulsive, but without thinking it through, I started walking quickly toward it, not running but moving with purpose. Maybe I thought it would reveal itself to be something explainable. Maybe I just needed to know. As soon as I moved, its head snapped in my direction. Even from that distance, I could tell it had seen me. It immediately stopped its swaying and bolted off the trail, down the bushy slope of the ridge. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I walked to the spot where it had been, looking for footprints or any sign it had been there. The dirt showed some disturbance, but nothing clear enough to make out distinct prints. I peered down the slope where it had disappeared, but the chaparral was too thick to see through. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed when movement caught my eye. About 30 yards further down the trail, it had reappeared. It was standing perfectly still now, just watching me. From this new distance, I could see it more clearly. It stood upright, completely bipedal, with long arms hanging at its sides. The black hair covered its entire body, including what I could see of its face. Its face, God, I still see it when I close my eyes sometimes. Not quite human, not quite animal. Somewhere in between, its eyes were deep set, dark, and undeniably intelligent. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. I wasn't afraid, strangely enough. I should have been terrified, but what I felt was awe, wonder, and the distinct feeling that I was in the presence of something rare and extraordinary. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I knew I needed to continue my hike if I wanted to get back to my car before dark, but I couldn't just walk away from this moment like it was nothing. On impulse, I slowly raised my arms out to my sides, then swept them upward in a grand, exaggerated wave, a gesture of acknowledgement. Of goodbye, maybe. What happened next still makes my skin prickle when I think about it. The creature, the Bigfoot, because what else could it have been, mimicked my gesture exactly. It raised its long, hair-covered arms and swept them up in the same wave I had just performed. It was deliberate, it was conscious, it was communication. Then it turned and disappeared down the slope again, this time for good. I stood there shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer enormity of what had just transpired. Had I really just exchanged greetings with a creature that wasn't supposed to exist? The hike back to my car is a blur in my memory. I remember checking over my shoulder constantly, half hoping, half fearing I would see it again. I didn't. I made it back to the parking lot just as dusk was settling in. My car was the only one left. I sat in my Honda for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what had happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some elaborate prank? But deep down I knew it was neither of those things. I had encountered something genuine, something unexplainable by conventional knowledge. In the days that followed, I debated whether to report what I'd seen. I even drove to the local ranger station once, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, then left without going in. What would I say? Who would believe me? I had no evidence, no photographs, nothing but my own experience. I did research, though, lots of it. I found books about Bigfoot sightings, joined a few newsletters, this was before the internet was widely available, and discovered that the foothills where I'd been hiking had other reported sightings over the years. Not many, but enough to make me feel less alone in my experience. The detail that haunts me most is that wave, that moment of connection. It wasn't just mimicry, there was understanding behind it, recognition, one sentient being acknowledging another across an unbridgeable divide of species. I've hiked those trails many times since then, always with a camera, always with the hope of another encounter. It's never happened again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if stress or exhaustion played tricks on my mind that day, but then I remember those eyes looking into mine, and I know what I saw was real. This happened 34 years ago, and I've told very few people about it. Most would think I'm making it up, or that I was confused about what I saw, but I know what I experienced on that trail. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, an unknown primate, it was real, it was intelligent, and for one brief moment, we connected. I still go hiking whenever I can, though I've moved away from Pasadena now, and every time I'm on a quiet trail and the birds suddenly go silent, I stop and listen, just in case. Story 16. I still have trouble talking about what happened last December near Silverton. I've been living in the Kootenay region of British Columbia for about 8 years now, and nothing like this has ever happened before. I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal or goes looking for trouble, but what my friends and I experienced that night changed how I see these mountains forever. It was December 18th, 2020, just a week before Christmas. Me, my brother Jeff, and our friends Sarah and Mike had been in Silverton for a small holiday get-together at Mike's cousin's place. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few drinks, some good food, and catching up. We left around 9:30 at night to head back to our cabin about 20 miles away. The night was freezing cold, probably around 15 degrees below zero, with at least 2 feet of fresh snow on the ground from a storm that had passed through earlier that week. Jeff was driving his old Subaru Outback. Thank God for all-wheel drive in these conditions. The headlights were cutting through this pitch-black darkness, and the snow was reflecting the light back at us, making it almost harder to see. I remember we were listening to some podcast about conspiracy theories, which seems ironic now. Sarah was in the back seat with Mike, while I rode shotgun next to Jeff. We were about halfway home, on this winding mountain road called Snowy Pass Road. There aren't any streetlights out there, just wilderness on both sides, tall pines covered in snow, and the occasional cliff drop-off that makes your stomach turn if you look down too long. Slow down a bit, I remember saying to Jeff. The road's getting slippery here. The temperature had dropped even further, and we could see ice forming in patches on the asphalt. That's when Sarah suddenly shouted from the back seat, "What is that? Stop the car!" Jeff hit the brakes, maybe a little too hard because we skidded slightly before coming to a stop. The headlights illuminated something on the right side of the road, maybe 30 feet ahead of us. "Is that a bear?" Mike asked, leaning forward between the front seats to get a better look. At first, that's what I thought too. It was dark and bulky, standing near a cluster of trees at the edge of the road, but as we all stared, I realized something was seriously wrong with what I was seeing. Bears don't stand that tall, and they definitely aren't active in the middle of December in these mountains. They should all be hibernating by now. "That's not a bear," I whispered, my breath fogging up the window as I pressed closer to the glass. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was standing completely upright, facing the trees, not us. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, like a linebacker wearing several winter coats. It was covered in dark, shaggy, I don't even want to call it fur. It looked matted and thick, with ice or snow clinging to parts of it. None of us said anything for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then the thing must have sensed us because it slowly turned its head, not its whole body, just its head, in our direction. I couldn't make out a face, just a darker patch where a face should be. No reflective eyes caught in our headlights like you'd see with most animals. Nothing. "What the hell is that?" Jeff's voice cracked as he said it, as if responding to his voice, the creature did something I'll never forget. It dropped down onto all fours, but not like an animal would. It was awkward, unnatural, like a human trying to imitate a bear or something. Its limbs didn't bend right. It looked uncomfortable, like it wasn't meant to be on 4 legs, but was forcing itself into that position. Then it moved into the trees, not running exactly, but covering ground fast. The way it moved sent chills through me, not fully like a quadruped, more like it was dragging itself forward with its arms while pushing with its legs. Within seconds, it disappeared into the darkness beyond our headlights. We sat there in complete silence for at least a minute. I could hear everyone breathing hard. "Did everyone see that?" Sarah finally asked, her voice shaking. We all nodded. "That wasn't a bear," Mike said. "Bears don't stand like that, and they're hibernating now anyway." "Let's get out of here," Jeff said, putting the car back in drive. But I stopped him. "Wait, we need to know what that was. We're only about 5 miles from the cabin now. Let's go drop off our stuff and come back with flashlights." Looking back, that was probably the stupidest suggestion I've ever made. But we were all in shock, and I think we needed to confirm what we'd seen wasn't just our imagination playing tricks on us. We drove to the cabin in tense silence. The 20-minute drive felt like hours. Every shadow in the forest looked like it might be that thing watching us. When we finally pulled up to our place, we practically ran inside. "We should call someone," Sarah suggested, once we were in the warmth of the cabin. "And say what?" Jeff replied. "That we saw some kind of monster on the road. They'll think we're drunk or high." He had a point. We grabbed 4 powerful flashlights and Mike took his hunting knife. Jeff wanted to bring his shotgun, but I talked him out of it. I was worried about accidentally shooting each other in the dark if we panicked. We piled back into the car and headed back to the spot. The whole way there, I kept thinking we were making a huge mistake, but curiosity was stronger than fear at that point. When we arrived at the location, Jeff pulled over exactly where we'd stopped before. The road was empty, silent. We left the headlights on, pointing toward the trees where the creature had disappeared. "I can't believe we're doing this," Sarah muttered as we got out of the car. The cold hit me like a physical blow. We stood in the road for a moment, our flashlight beams dancing across the snow-covered ground and into the trees. That's when I spotted them. Tracks in the fresh snow, leading from the road into the forest. "Look," I said, pointing my light at the ground. The prints were enormous. Each one was wider than my hand, with fingers spread. They weren't round like bear paws, but elongated, almost foot-like. I crouched down to look closer, and what really disturbed me was the detail. These weren't just depressions in the snow. They had structure with what looked like 5 toes at the front. "Those are 16, maybe 17 inches long," Mike said, putting his gloved hand next to one for comparison. His hand looked tiny beside it. The track showed an unusual pattern. There were clear bipedal prints, 2 feet walking upright, and then places where something had dragged through the snow, corresponding to where we'd seen the thing drop to all 4s. "This isn't possible," Jeff whispered. "What the hell makes tracks like this?" I stood up and aimed my flashlight into the dark trees. There's only one thing I know of that's supposed to walk on 2 legs and then go down on all 4s sometimes, but I never believed they were real. None of us said the word out loud. We didn't need to. "Let's follow them," Mike suggested, "just a little way in." "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed. "That thing could be watching us right now." As she said it, I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being observed. The fine hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. "We're not alone," I said quietly. The forest around us was unnaturally silent. In these mountains, even in winter, you usually hear something. Wind in the trees, small animals, distant birds. But there was nothing except the sound of our breathing and the crunch of snow under our boots. Despite every instinct telling me to run back to the car, I took a few steps toward the tree line, following the tracks. The others reluctantly followed. The prints led about 20 yards into the forest before turning sharply to the left. We followed them, our flashlight beams bouncing off snow-laden branches and creating shifting shadows that made me jump more than once. "Wait," Mike said suddenly, grabbing my arm. "Listen." We all froze. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then it came, a deep, low vocalization that seemed to vibrate the air around us. It wasn't a growl or a roar, more like, I don't know how to describe it except as a rumbling hum that rose and fell in pitch. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard in these woods. Not a bear, not a cougar, nothing. "It's the same sound," Sarah whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Last month, when we were staying here, remember? We heard that weird sound in the middle of the night, and you said it was probably a bear." She was right. About 3 weeks earlier, we'd been woken up around 3 in the morning by a similar sound outside the cabin. It had gone on for almost 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. We'd written it off as some strange animal noise carried by the wind. The vocalization stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc and caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards away, between 2 large pines, A pair of eyes reflected our light. They were set too high off the ground to be any normal wildlife. They weren't the yellow-green of a bear or the pale gold of a cougar. They were dark, almost reddish, and they were watching us. "Back to the car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now, don't run." We started backing away slowly, keeping our lights pointed in the direction of those eyes. They never moved, never blinked, just watched us retreat. When we reached the road, Jeff spoke up. "One more thing I need to check." He walked about 20 feet down the road. Away from where we'd seen the creature initially, he bent down, examining something in the snow. "These tracks cross the road," he called to us. It was following the road before we saw it. That's when another realization hit me. "The tree structure," I said. "What tree structure?" Mike asked. "Remember that weird formation of trees we found while hiking back in October, about a half-mile from the cabin? Those trees that were crossed and woven together?" Everyone nodded. We'd stumbled across a bizarre arrangement of young pine trees during a hike. Several trees had been bent and twisted together in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. We'd joked that some local kids must have made it as some kind of fort, but it was miles from any nearby homes or campgrounds. "I've been reading stuff online," I continued. "People say those structures are markers or territories." "Territories for what?" Sarah asked, though I think she already knew the answer. A crack of breaking branches echoed from the forest, much closer than where we'd seen the eyes. It sounded like something large was moving through the trees, parallel to the road, keeping pace with us. "Get in the car!" Jeff shouted, abandoning any pretense of calm. We scrambled into the Subaru, slamming the doors. Jeff started the engine and threw it into drive, tires spinning on the icy road before catching. As we accelerated away, I looked out the back window. Standing in the middle of the road where we'd just been was the figure. In the red glow of our taillights, it looked even larger than before. Completely upright now, arms hanging at its sides. It didn't move or try to follow us. It just stood there, watching our car disappear around the bend. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin. We locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and sat in the living room with the lights on until dawn. Nobody slept. In the morning, we packed our things and left. I haven't been back to that cabin since then. None of us have talked much about what happened that night, but I know we all saw the same thing. I've spent countless hours researching since then, trying to find some rational explanation for what we encountered. But deep down, I know what we saw. In these remote mountains, far from cell service and city lights, something else lives among the trees, something that walks on 2 legs but can drop to 4, something that builds structures in the forest and makes sounds like nothing else on Earth. I still dream about those tracks in the snow and those eyes watching us from the darkness. I don't tell many people this story. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But I know what I saw that December night near Silverton, and I know I never want to see it again. Story 17. I still get cold chills thinking about what happened that 4th of July weekend 3 years ago. My husband Derek and I had just moved from Colorado to Northern California, and we were excited to explore our new surroundings. We'd only been married 6 months, and camping was our thing. We both loved getting away from civilization and spending time in nature. Since it was a holiday weekend, I expected all the campgrounds to be packed. Derek called the ranger station for recommendations, and they suggested we try the area around Squaw Creek, near Shasta Lake. The ranger mentioned if we wanted real isolation, we could follow this old logging road past the established campgrounds and find a spot to ourselves. That sounded perfect to us. We packed up our Subaru with our camping gear, plenty of food, and our husky, Luna. I remember feeling so happy as we drove up into the mountains, windows down, music playing. Derek kept saying how much better the wilderness was here compared to the touristy spots back in Colorado. After about 40 minutes on this narrow, bumpy logging road, we found this little clearing about 200 yards from the road. It was near a beautiful meadow surrounded by dense forest. The spot was perfect, flat ground for our tent, a natural clearing for a fire pit, and complete privacy. No other campers for miles. We set up camp quickly. It was already late afternoon, and Derek wanted to explore before sunset. We followed a faint trail that led deeper into the woods and discovered this abandoned beaver dam with a small pond absolutely teeming with fish. Derek got excited about fishing the next morning, but I was getting tired and wanted to head back. Luna seemed antsy too, pulling on her leash and whining. "I'm going to keep exploring a bit," Derek said. "You take Luna back to camp and I'll be there in an hour." I headed back with Luna, and that's when I first noticed something odd. Luna kept stopping, turning around and growling toward the forest. I assumed she was just picking up on wildlife scents, but her behavior was strange. She's usually so calm. When we got back to camp, she refused to settle down. She kept pacing around the perimeter of our campsite, staring into the woods and occasionally growling. Then I noticed this horrible smell near our tent. It was like a mix of rotting garbage, wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. I actually accused Luna of rolling in something dead, but when I checked her fur, she was clean. The smell seemed to come and go with the breeze. Derek returned about an hour later, looking slightly disturbed. When I asked what was wrong, he hesitated before answering. "Something was following me," he said quietly. "I kept hearing branches breaking behind me, but whenever I stopped, it stopped too." He explained how he'd made himself look big and made noise, thinking it might be a mountain lion. Whatever it was, it didn't approach him, but he felt watched the entire walk back. I told him about Luna's behavior and the awful smell, but we brushed it off. We were in the wilderness after all. Strange smells and sounds were to be expected. We made dinner on our camp stove as dusk fell. Just some freeze-dried pasta that tasted amazing after our day of hiking. We built up a good campfire and sat talking about our plans for the weekend. Luna finally seemed to relax, curling up by the fire. Then, around 10 o'clock, everything changed. The fire had burned down to embers when we heard it, branches breaking in the forest about 50 yards behind our tent. Luna instantly shot up, the fur on her back standing straight up as she let out this deep, threatening growl I'd never heard from her before. Derek grabbed his flashlight and scanned the tree line, but we couldn't see anything. The breaking branches continued, moving parallel to our campsite, like something large was pacing back and forth just beyond our sight. Then we heard the noise. I still don't know how to describe it properly. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was like a deep, guttural howl that turned into something like a scream. It made my skin crawl and the hair on my arms stand up. Derek immediately went to our tent and grabbed his handgun from his backpack. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I don't know," Derek said, his voice tense. "But it's not a bear or a mountain lion." I quickly threw more wood on the fire, building it up as high as I could. The breaking branches stopped as soon as the flames grew higher. Luna was absolutely terrified now, pressing herself against my legs and trembling. Derek aimed his flashlight into the trees again, moving the beam slowly across the darkness. That's when he pointed out something that made my blood run cold. There were no reflecting eyes out there. Every animal's eyes reflect light in the darkness, but whatever was watching us didn't have that reflection. The stench suddenly hit us again, stronger than before, that same putrid, musky odor I'd noticed earlier. It was so overpowering, I had to cover my nose with my shirt. We stayed by the fire, back to back, scanning the darkness. Every few minutes, we'd hear movement in the underbrush, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but always just beyond the firelight. Whatever it was, it seemed to be circling our camp, staying just out of sight. Around midnight, the creature made another approach. The sound of breaking branches was much closer this time, maybe 30 yards away. Luna was beside herself, barking and growling. Derek fired a warning shot into the air, and we heard something large crashing through the underbrush, moving away from us. The relief was short-lived. After about 20 minutes of silence, we heard it again, approaching from a different direction. This time, Derek shouted and banged a pot with a metal spoon, making as much noise as possible. Again, the thing retreated. We realized we were in a terrible situation. Our car was parked 200 yards away, across dark woods and a small creek. To reach it, we'd have to walk through pitch darkness, and whatever was out there could easily intercept us. We decided our best option was to keep the fire going all night and wait until morning. "We just need to make it until sunrise," Derek kept saying, more to himself than to me. We took turns adding wood to the fire, determined not to let it die down. Every hour or so, the thing would approach again, and we'd make noise to drive it away. The pattern continued all night. Approach, retreat, silence, approach again. It was exhausting and terrifying. Despite our best efforts to stay awake, we both dozed off sometime around 4 in the morning. I don't know how long we were asleep. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. But we woke to Luna's frantic barking and the sound of something charging through the brush directly toward our camp. Derek jumped up, shouting and waving his arms. I scrambled to throw more wood on the dying fire. The flames shot up just as something large stopped at the edge of our clearing. For a split second, I thought I saw a massive dark shape just beyond the firelight. Something tall and broad-shouldered, but it immediately backed away when the fire blazed up. As dawn finally approached, the encounters stopped. We sat in exhausted silence as the forest gradually lightened around us. Birds started singing, and that horrible tension in the air seemed to dissipate. Luna finally stopped growling and laid down, though she still looked on edge. "We need to get out of here," I said as soon as it was fully light. Derek nodded, and we began hastily packing up our campsite. In our rush, Derek realized he'd left his hatchet and cooking tools down by the creek. He insisted on retrieving them while I finished packing the tent. "I'll be quick," he promised. "It's daylight now, we're fine." I watched him disappear down the trail, Luna and I both on high alert. 10 minutes later, he came running back, white as a sheet. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the car without saying a word. "What? What happened?" I asked, terrified by the look on his face. "The smell," he gasped. "It's all over our campsite by the creek. And the tracks." "What tracks?" "I don't know. They're not bear tracks. They're huge, like feet, but not human. And there's broken branches 15 feet up the trees." We practically ran to the car, threw our gear in the back, and got out of there as fast as possible. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. What could we say? We had no explanation for what had happened. For years we told ourselves it must have been a bear. Though deep down we knew bears don't behave that way. We never went camping in that area again. In fact, we barely went camping at all after that. It wasn't until last year, when we were having dinner with friends and telling our weird camping story, that someone mentioned Bigfoot. Our friend pulled up some research about Sasquatch encounters in the Shasta Lake wilderness. And as he read the descriptions, the wood knocking, the awful smell, the vocalizations, the intimidation behavior, Derek and I just looked at each other in shock. Every detail matched what we'd experienced. I still don't know what stalked us that night. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot. I'm not ready to commit to that explanation, but I know what we experienced was real, and it wasn't any normal wildlife encounter. Whatever it was intelligent enough to test our defenses, to retreat when threatened, and to circle back from different directions. It knew exactly how to stay hidden just beyond our sight. And 3 years later, I still wake up sometimes hearing that inhuman howl scream echoing in my head. All I know for certain is that there's something in those woods that doesn't want to be found. And if you camp in the wrong spot, it will let you know you're not welcome. Story 18. My wife Caroline and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd saved up for a decent RV rental and picked Klamath National Forest because we'd heard it was less crowded than some of the other parks in Northern California. We wanted peace and quiet, just the two of us surrounded by nature. God, I wish we'd picked somewhere else. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and found this perfect little spot about 7 miles down an old Forest Service road. No designated campground, just a small clearing near a creek that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in weeks. I remember feeling so satisfied when we parked. The spot was beautiful, secluded, with tall pines all around and this little babbling creek nearby. Caroline took pictures while I set up our little outdoor area with the folding chairs and a small fire pit. That first day was perfect. We hiked a bit, cooked dinner outside, and watched the sunset through the trees. Nothing felt off at all, just the normal forest sounds. Birds, the creek, wind in the trees. The feeling started the second day. We'd gone for a longer hike that morning, maybe 4 miles along this overgrown trail. The whole time I felt, I don't know how to explain it exactly. Like we were being followed? Not in a direct way, but this sensation that something was paralleling our path through the denser forest alongside the trail. Caroline felt it too. She kept stopping to look over her shoulder. We didn't see anything though, so we tried to laugh it off. Probably just a deer, I remember telling her. They're curious but shy. By late afternoon we were back at our campsite, but that feeling hadn't gone away. I was trying to read outside while Caroline made sandwiches in the RV, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd look up, scanning the tree line. The birds had gotten quieter too. At the time I didn't think much of it, but looking back, that should have been a warning. Around 6 in the evening I decided to gather more firewood. The spot about 30 yards behind our RV had plenty of fallen branches. I was picking up a good-sized piece when I got this overwhelming urge to stand up and look to my left. There it was, about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, stood something I still struggled to describe. It was huge. I'm 6'1", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, not fur like a bear, hair like a human's but longer and coarser. It was standing upright, one massive hand wrapped around the trunk of the tree. The other arm hung at its side. I froze completely. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. They don't have shoulders that broad or proportions that human-like. But it wasn't human either. Not even close. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. Its face was hard to make out in the shadows, but I could see eyes reflecting the evening light. Dark, intelligent eyes, watching me with clear purpose. I slowly backed away, never turning my back to it. When I reached the RV, I called out to Caroline as calmly as I could manage. "Honey, I need you to come inside right now." My voice was shaking. She must have heard something in my tone because she appeared at the door immediately. "What's wrong? Get inside, now." I didn't want to scare her, but I needed her safe. Once we were both inside with the door locked, I told her what I'd seen. She didn't laugh or question me. She could see how shaken I was. We went to the window together and looked out toward where I'd spotted the creature. It was gone, but the forest suddenly seemed menacing, like it was closing in around our tiny RV. "What do we do?" Caroline whispered. "Should we leave?" I wanted to. God, I wanted to start the engine and get the hell out of there, but it was getting dark, and that Forest Service road was rough and narrow even in daylight. Trying to navigate it at night seemed more dangerous than staying put. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," I decided. "The RV is secure. We'll be okay for one night." We closed all the curtains and tried to act normal. Made dinner, though neither of us had much appetite. Tried watching a movie on the little TV we'd brought, but couldn't focus. Every sound from outside made us jump. The creek that had seemed so peaceful now sounded ominous. The wind in the trees became whispers. The normal forest noises had changed somehow, like the whole ecosystem was on edge. Around 10:30, we decided to try to sleep. Maybe things would seem less frightening in the morning light. Caroline took the bed in the back, while I said I'd sleep on the converted dinette closer to the front door. In reality, I didn't plan on sleeping at all. I kept a flashlight and the rental's tire iron next to me. Fat lot of good that would have done, but it made me feel a little better. For about an hour, nothing happened. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls, no nighttime insects. Just silence and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was starting to think maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it had been some weird shadow, or my mind playing tricks after too many hours in the sun. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. Not the quick patter of a deer or the ambling gait of a bear. These were slow, measured steps that made tiny vibrations I could feel through the floor of the RV. I sat up, clutching the tire iron. The footsteps stopped directly outside the main door. I heard breathing, deep, rough breathing that no human or animal I know makes. Then a smell seeped in through the window seals, a musky, wild odor that made my nose wrinkle. The RV shifted slightly, like something had leaned against it. I heard Caroline wake up in the back. "Rich?" Her voice was small and terrified. "Stay there," I whispered back. "Don't move." The pressure against the side of the RV increased. Whatever was out there was pushing against the vehicle. I could hear the metal groaning. Then there was a dragging sound, like something running its hand or paw down the length of the RV. I could track the movement from one end to the other. The pushing stopped, and the footsteps continued their circuit. Around the back where Caroline was, I heard her gasp, and I knew she could hear it too, probably just feet away from where she was lying. Then everything escalated. The RV started to shake, not gently, but violently, like something was deliberately trying to rock it. I lost my balance and fell against the wall. I could hear things falling in the small kitchen area, cups, plates crashing to the floor. Caroline screamed from the back. "Richard, what's happening?" I couldn't answer. I was too busy watching in horror as the RV rocked back and forth. The whole vehicle was moving, tilting side to side. Whatever was doing this had incredible strength. We're talking about a 24-foot RV being shaken like a child's toy. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started. The footsteps returned faster now, still circling. I managed to crawl to Caroline, and we huddled together on the bed, listening to this thing pace around our RV. The breathing got louder, more aggressive, almost like huffing. Then it slammed against the door. Not just pushed, slammed. The entire doorframe buckled inward. The lock held, but I knew it wouldn't survive another hit like that. Caroline was crying silently beside me. I was trying to think of what to do if it got in, but my mind was blank with fear. It hit the door again. The frame cracked. One more hit and it would be inside with us, but the third hit never came. Instead, the footsteps circled the RV one more time, slower now. The breathing continued, and then I heard something new. A sound that still haunts my nightmares. A low, rumbling growl that turned into something almost like speech, not words, but vocalized in a way that felt deliberate and communicative. It wasn't random animal noise. It had pattern and intention. After that, the footsteps moved away, heavy at first, then gradually fading until we couldn't hear them anymore. We stayed frozen, barely breathing, for at least an hour. Neither of us dared to look outside or make a sound. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is light streaming through the windows. Morning came, and for a brief moment I thought maybe it had all been some shared nightmare. But then I saw the damage. Cabinet doors hanging open, broken dishes on the floor, and the RV door. The frame was visibly bent, the metal warped inward. We looked at each other, and without saying a word, we knew we needed to see what was outside. Together, we cautiously opened the door. The clearing looked different in daylight. What had been an idyllic campsite now felt exposed and vulnerable. But what made my blood run cold were the footprints. Massive impressions in the soft soil around our campsite, each one easily twice the size of my boot. They circled the RV exactly as I'd heard the footsteps do. The depth of the prints suggested enormous weight, but the most unsettling discovery was the hair. Coarse, reddish-brown hair stuck to the window frames and door where the creature had pressed against the vehicle. Caroline found some on the back bumper too, where it must have pushed to rock the RV. We didn't say much as we packed up, didn't take pictures of the prints or collect the hair, though I wish we had. We just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. The drive out was tense. Every shadow in the forest looked like it might be hiding something watching us. It's been 21 years, and I've never gone camping since. Caroline and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes I'll catch her staring out into the woods behind our house with this wary look. We know what we experienced. We know it wasn't a bear or any other known animal. The deliberate way it observed us, then tried to intimidate us, to drive us away, that's not normal wildlife behavior. I used to find peace in nature. Now I just feel unease, because I know we're not alone out there. There are things in the wilderness, intelligent, powerful things, that we don't understand, and they don't want us there. Sometimes at night I still wake up thinking I hear those heavy footsteps circling my house, and for a moment I'm back in that RV, waiting for the door to give way.